Story 1. There are certain jobs that wear away at a man's nerves in slow, invisible ways, and driving the funeral van through the back roads of America in the dead of night is one of them. The night they called me in, I was already used to the emptiness that hung over every shift, used to the way fog draped the landscape like a shroud, how the highway lights flickered with no rhythm, and how silence pressed so thick you could almost hear the echo of your own pulse in the cab. My assignment was simple: drive a single closed casket to the old town of Cinder Creek, leave it at the receiving chapel, sign the forms, and turn back before sunrise. I'd done the run before, but never at this hour, and never so alone. The city faded behind me, replaced by long stretches of asphalt, split by the yellow stripe, and bordered on both sides by endless fields and the occasional hunched silhouette of an abandoned barn. The fog grew thicker the further I drove, curling around the headlights and turning the van's beams into wavering tunnels of ghostly white. There were no other cars, not a single trucker or state trooper, not even the distant red eyes of a raccoon or fox at the side of the road. It felt as though I had slipped into a world that belonged to no one adrift. Untethered, the van's engine a lonely heartbeat on a road that refused to end. Every so often, the lights along the road would flicker and dim, casting the world into an eerie blue for a split second before sputtering back to life. I checked my mirrors and saw nothing behind me but the undulating darkness and the bulk of the casket, covered in a blue velvet drape, still and uncomplaining. I should have found comfort in routine, but that night, everything was off. The GPS blinked in and out, losing signal, then recovering. My phone had no bars. Even the radio, which I usually kept low for company, crackled with static whenever I reached for the dial, as if warning me to keep my focus on the silent road ahead. As the hours slipped by, a sense of being watched grew strong enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't just nerves or the weight of my cargo. This was something more. A prickling at the back of my neck, the feeling that another presence was pressing in from the dark just beyond the glass. I found myself glancing more and more into the rearview mirror, hoping not to see anything, but always feeling as if, the moment I let my guard down, someone or something would be there. The road narrowed as I left the last gas station behind, the fog now so thick that the world seemed to shrink to just me, the van, and whatever waited unseen in the mist. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, whispering to myself that it was just another job, just another delivery, just another night. But the silence argued otherwise, stretching on until the shape of the world felt as thin and fragile as breath on cold glass waiting. It seemed for something to break. The hours passed with only the sound of the tires on wet pavement and the steady, mechanical tick of the dashboard clock to keep me company. Cinder Creek still lay miles ahead, and the landscape outside had dissolved into formless shadows, the headlights carving uncertain paths through the dense, drifting fog. I kept both hands tight on the wheel, the air in the van growing colder, the silence growing heavier. It was during one of those endless stretches, my eyelids drooping in the monotony, that I noticed a flicker of movement on the shoulder, a shape emerging from the whiteout, arm raised in a slow, deliberate wave. A man stood at the edge of the road, perfectly still in the weak halo of my high beams. He wore a black suit, the kind that seemed out of place on a country highway, the lapels gleaming faintly with mist. His face was obscured by the brim of his hat in the swirling fog, but even at a distance, there was a gravity to him, something that made my stomach tighten. I knew the protocols: never pick up strangers, especially on a funeral run, but as my foot eased off the gas, I felt the decision slip out of my hands, as if I'd been rehearsing this moment my entire life. The van slowed, the engine's rumble fading to a hush, and I rolled down the window a crack, heart pounding with equal parts dread and curiosity. Headed to Cinder Creek? A man asked. His voice was soft, almost echoing, like the wind threading through an empty church. I nodded, unable to find my own words, and before I could object, he circled the van and opened the passenger door with a practiced hand. The hinges groaned, a sound much too loud in the night, and he settled into the front seat with a composure that made me shiver. He didn't thank me, didn't offer a name, only sat facing forward, hands folded on his lap, his eyes strikingly dark when I glanced at him fixed on the winding road ahead. For a mile or two, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the engine, the squelch of tires rolling through puddles, and the faint, rhythmic thump from the casket in the back, as if it too had felt the shift in the night's order. I forced myself to ask, "What brings you out here?" My voice sounded strange in the stillness, paper-thin and trembling. The man smiled just a little, lips barely moving. "Sometimes a person finds himself far from home, waiting for the right ride," he said, as if that explained everything. The air inside the van turned colder still, my breath fogging faintly. I couldn't shake the impression that the interior had grown smaller, as though the weight of another presence pressed in on all sides. At every stop sign and curve, the man's head would tilt just slightly, following the movement of the casket, as if he were tracking an old friend or a debt that needed settling. There was no warmth in his presence, but no malice either, only the unnerving sense that I was playing a part in a story already written, delivering something more than a casket to a town that barely appeared on any map. The ride stretched out in uneasy silence, headlights tunneling deeper into the night, the figure beside me a quiet, impossible passenger whose purpose I was not meant to understand. Yet still, I drove on, unable to turn back, unable to resist the growing certainty that the road, the van, and the stranger by my side were all bound by something far older and stranger than chance, and that whatever was coming next had already begun, long before I ever touched the wheel. The farther we drove, the more the world seemed to fade around us. Fog pressed so thick against the van's windows that every turn of the headlights painted only a dull white wall, making it impossible to gauge the distance we'd traveled or how long we'd been on the road. My passenger sat impossibly still, hands folded and eyes fixed straight ahead. His presence was a weight in the van, turning every breath shallow and uncertain. Every so often I'd glance sideways, trying to catch a clearer look at his face, but the brim of his hat and the shifting gloom always kept him just out of focus. It was when we reached the crest of a narrow hill, flanked by gnarled trees and broken fence posts, that I realized the interior of the van had grown even colder. My fingers stiffened on the wheel, and a thin layer of condensation began to creep over the inside of the windshield. I looked into the rearview mirror out of habit, searching for some reassurance in the reflection of the cargo bay behind me. For a split second, everything looked as it should: the velvet-draped casket, the orderly stacks of funeral linens and wreaths, the empty expanse of shadow behind us. But then, with a jolt that stole the air from my chest, I saw him. The man in the suit was no longer sitting in the passenger seat. He was in the back, perfectly upright in the very spot where the casket should have been. The casket itself was gone, its space consumed by his silent, looming figure. His face was now fully visible in the dim blue light of the dashboard, eyes wide and far too bright, a thin, knowing smile playing on his lips. I blinked and jerked my head around, but the front seat beside me was empty. My heart hammered, and I gripped the wheel so tightly, my knuckles ached. In the rear view, he watched me. "You ever think about what it's like, being the one left behind?" His voice, though his lips barely moved, echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once, as though it vibrated through the engine and the frame of the van itself. I tried to answer, but the words caught in my throat. He continued, his tone casual, almost gentle. "Strange thing, riding in the dark, always bringing others to their rest, but never resting yourself. You think the dead ever notice the difference?" He leaned forward, eyes locked on mine in the mirror, and asked, "Do you remember every funeral, every name?" The air in the van thickened until it was hard to breathe, as if the fog outside had seeped in to fill my lungs with cold. My mind spun. I tried to look away, but every time my eyes returned to the mirror, he was there, closer, the smile stretching wider, as if he knew secrets I had spent a lifetime hiding. Questions about the afterlife, about burial rites and the nature of memory, spilled from his lips, each word scratching at something buried deep inside me. The van felt smaller with every passing mile, every answer I failed to give. No matter how many times I blinked, the image in the mirror did not change. The casket was gone. Only the man remained, his presence filling every corner of the van and every corner of my mind, making me wonder quietly, desperately, if I was still the driver, or if I had become just another passenger in a procession that never truly ends. Panic prickled along my spine, yet the van kept moving forward, as if the steering wheel were no longer under my control. The headlights carved bright rivers through the fog, their beams flickering in and out, distorting the world beyond the glass into wavering sheets of pale and shadow. I pressed the brakes, tried to pull over, but the van refused to respond each turn of the wheel. Each tap of the pedal only looped us back onto the same stretch of narrow country road, the same ruined mile markers and leaning fence posts ghosting by again and again. It was as if the night itself had become an endless reel, replaying our journey with small, inexplicable changes, every loop drawing the darkness in tighter. My eyes darted from the useless GPS, now a static-lit void, to the rearview mirror, where the man in the suit sat motionless, his gaze fixed on me with a patience that felt centuries old. The air inside the van crackled with anticipation, the silence alive with secrets. A man's voice calm, relentless filled the van. Do you really remember everyone you carry, or just the ones you can't forget? His smile deepened, and then he began to recite details from my own life, things I'd never told a soul. The funeral in the rain, when I dropped a ring and didn't confess. The route I took to avoid passing my childhood home. The silent wishes I'd made for mercy at the edge of every empty grave. He spoke of my regrets, my failures, my doubts, each one surfacing like a shrouded body in the dark. I tried to shout, to demand answers, but the words died in my throat. The world beyond the windshield had dissolved entirely. The only landmarks now the accusing beams of the headlights and the endless undulation of the road. It became clear that I was not driving anywhere real, not anymore. My hands trembled, sweat freezing on my palms, as the man leaned forward, face ghostly in the dashboard light. Sometimes the dead don't need a ride, he said softly. They just need someone to remember why they're here and what they left behind. The van jerked as if crossing a threshold, headlights briefly illuminating a series of names carved into the mist names I recognized, and names I had never learned, all the passengers I'd ferried, but never truly known. My own name flickered there, just for a heartbeat, before vanishing into the fog. The man's eyes met mine in the mirror, full of sorrow and strange mercy. Everyone rides with you in the end, he whispered, and suddenly the van was empty. The silence absolute, except for my ragged breathing and the muffled thump of my pulse, echoing through the hollow space where a casket should have been. I gripped the wheel, desperate to break free, but every turn only drew me deeper into the loop. The road would not let me go, the lights always bending back upon themselves, and somewhere just out of sight, the passenger's voice echoed, no destination, only memory. I understood then that the journey was not through any landscape I'd ever known, but through the shadows of my own conscience, a procession with no end, guided by a passenger who had always been waiting for me in the dark. Desperation clawed at my chest as I fought the compulsion to drive, trying to will the van to stop, to force my hands from the wheel, to shatter the spell that held me captive on that endless road. But every attempt to escape brought me back to the same patch of broken pavement, the same battered sign swallowed by fog, the same eerie hush, as if the world itself had curled into a knot that did not be untied. The headlights could not pierce the gloom any further, and the van felt less like a vehicle and more like a coffin on wheels, trapping me in a space where the rules of the living no longer applied. Several times, I flung open the door and stumbled out, boots crunching on gravel that seemed to absorb all sound. The night air was thick and suffocating, every breath tasting of cold earth and old flowers. Yet no matter which direction I ran down the embankment, into the tree line, along the shoulder, I found myself drawn inexorably back to the van, the interior light flickering to life before I even touched the handle. Each return left me more hollow, the world outside dissolving into an ocean of gray, until the only reality that remained was the cabin, the wheel, and the shape that lingered behind me in the rearview, half-formed and infinitely patient. As the first pale blush of dawn seeped into the fog, the van finally came to a halt, though I could not recall making the decision. The world outside was still empty. No sign of Cinder Creek, no chapel, just the endless quiet of a place that existed for no one. I turned in my seat, hands numb with dread, and saw that the casket was back in its place behind me, perfectly aligned, the velvet smooth and unblemished. The man in the suit was gone, but a chill lingered in the air, coiling around my shoulders and settling in my bones. Something compelled me to check the casket. My breath rattled as I opened the hatch and stepped into the compartment, dread blooming like ice beneath my skin. On the polished brass plaque, newly engraved and gleaming, was my own name, letters sharp as a wound. The implications landed with the finality of dirt on a closed grave. My legs buckled, and I sank to the ground, the van's engine ticking softly as it cooled. I understood in that moment that I had crossed some border, stepped into the territory of the dead, and become another. Story whispered between midnight and morning by those who drive the lonely highways with a passenger they never invited and can never forget. When the sun finally rose, burning away the last traces of fog, I sat behind the wheel in perfect stillness. The world looked unchanged, but I was not. My hands remembered the shape of every key, my eyes every mile of lost road. Somewhere, on another lonely stretch, another driver would see a man in a suit, waiting at the edge of the night, and the cycle would begin again. Another destination, another name on a plaque, another passenger carried not toward a town or a chapel, but deeper into the endless procession where none of us ever truly arrive. Story 2. There is a peculiar kind of silence that settles inside a funeral van at night, the sort that seems to swallow even the hum of the engine, turning every mile into something slow and expectant. I had driven plenty of long routes before far-flung cemeteries, rural chapels perched at the edge of nowhere, roads where even the headlights felt like an intrusion. That night, though, the call came in later than usual. The rain was steady, relentless, drumming against the windshield in a syncopated rhythm, and the dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone with a sense of hushed urgency. The route was unfamiliar, a winding back road out to the old Green Hollow crematorium, a place I'd only ever heard mentioned in stories by drivers older than myself, always with a note of caution or a glance at the floor. The cargo was a simple pine coffin, lighter than most, with nothing remarkable about it, no flowers, no nameplate, no mourners waiting at the gate. The rain soaked through my jacket as I loaded it, alone in the dark, the chill running deeper than I cared to admit. When I finally slid into the driver's seat and shut the door, the quiet inside was absolute, broken only by the slow sweep of the wipers and the soft clicking of the dashboard clock. The roads outside town emptied quickly, the houses thinning and vanishing altogether. The world shrank to the twin cones of my headlights and the black ribbon of asphalt unfurling through the wet trees. As the miles drifted by, I grew aware of the isolation. No other cars passed me. No lights glowed in distant windows. My phone, uselessly propped on the console, flashed once and died. The radio spat only static. I kept glancing at the rear view, catching only the vague outline of the casket swaying in time with every bump and turn. In that darkness, every small sound was amplified. The creak of the suspension, the rattle of an old wrench rolling somewhere beneath the seat, the soft whistle of the heater working overtime. I told myself it was just another night, just another job. But the further I got from the city, the heavier the air became, as if something unseen pressed in from the edges of the road. I tried humming a tune, tapping my fingers on the wheel, anything to fill the hush, but the silence swallowed every attempt. The rain blurred the world beyond the glass, the headlights only illuminating more darkness. As the first hour slipped away, an unease settled in my gut, the kind you only notice once it's already been there for a while. That was when I first thought I heard a faint, uncertain sound from the back. A knock, maybe, or the echo of my own heartbeat amplified by nerves. I gripped the wheel tighter, eyes fixed on the empty, endless road, telling myself it was nothing, just the van settling or the storm's percussion. But the silence that followed was heavier still, and I knew deep down that something about this journey was different, that I was not as alone as I had convinced myself to be. I told myself it was nerves, just the rain and the darkness conspiring to play tricks on my senses. I kept my focus locked on the winding, rain-slicked road, knuckles whitening on the steering wheel each time a gust of wind rocked the van. But then it came again clearer this time, a dull, deliberate thud from the rear compartment, the sound unmistakable above the hush of the storm. My eyes darted to the rear-view mirror, where the pale shape of the pine coffin lurked at the edge of the headlight's weak glow. I waited, holding my breath, counting the seconds, telling myself I'd imagined it. Silence. Then knock, knock. 2 short raps, like knuckles on a table. I laughed it off, too loud in the cramped cab, and turned up the radio, but the static only grated on my nerves. The knocks returned, harder now. 3, then 4, then a pause. They fell into a pattern 1, 2, 3, 4, a rhythm that felt unnatural, deliberate, as if someone were testing the boundaries of the box, or reaching out for help from within. Every hair on my arms stood on end. My foot eased off the gas. I glanced again in the mirror. The coffin was unmoving, the straps secure, but the sound had come from no other place. Knock, 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 then a silence that roared in my ears. I pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to put distance behind me, but the farther I drove, the more insistent the knocks became. Sometimes they were frantic, rapid-fire, echoing like fists pounding on a locked door. Other times, slow and measured, a calm persistence that sent a different kind of chill through my bones. I tried to explain it away air pockets, shifting wood, the jostle of the road, but nothing fit the way the knocks grew louder when I addressed the casket aloud, or how they sometimes paused, as if in response, as if waiting for me to speak again. With each mile, the rhythm changed, shifting between chaos and order, a language I could almost but not quite understand. I began to dread every curve in the road, every new silence, every moment when the only sound was the thrum of my own pulse and the whisper of rain. I told myself I would not stop, that I would see the drive through, but with every insistent knock, I knew I was drawing closer to a choice one that would not wait for the safety of daylight or the sanctuary of the crematorium's stone walls. I was no longer driving alone, and whatever rode with me in that pine box was growing less patient with every passing mile. With every mile, the van crawled deeper into the storm, and knocks from the coffin grew impossible to ignore, evolving from random jolts to something deliberate, something that demanded attention. My hands trembled on the wheel as the rhythm shifted from frantic bursts to slow, carefully measured patterns, the cadence pressing itself into my nerves like cold fingers. I tried to reason with myself, logic, exhaustion, the mind's tricks after too many late-night shifts, but the sound cut through every excuse, persistent and purposeful. I turned off the useless radio, the only soundtrack now the twin heartbeats of the engine and the knocks behind me. At last, the tension snapped. I pulled the van onto the muddy shoulder at the only gas station for miles a place, shut down long ago, its sign a ghost in the rain, its windows hollow and black. The storm thrashed at the van, rocking it on its tires as I sat in the cab, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, listening. The knocks resumed, steady now, repeating in bursts. 2, pause, 3, pause, 4, pause, 2 again. The rhythm made my skin crawl. It was trying to say something. Desperation pried open an old memory from high school Morse code, the dots and dashes we'd hammered out on desks during boring classes. Could it really be? I found a pen in the glove compartment and scribbled each sequence on a receipt, counting knocks and spaces, frantic with the need to translate the sound. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, 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 pause. Tap dash, tap dash, tap dash, tap. I began to map them out, trying to align the knocks with the patterns I remembered. B, S. None of it made sense at first, but the repetition forced me to listen harder. Between bursts, the silence was worse, pressing in, thick as fog. I spoke to the coffin, my voice thin and shaking. What do you want? The knocks changed, becoming softer, as if whoever or whatever was inside was running out of strength or time. One, pause, two, pause. The message repeated, a code, a plea, words struggling to reach the world of the living through layers of wood and fear. With each cycle, I grew more certain this was not an echo or a trick of the mind, but a message insistent and urgent, hammering its way from death to life. Lightning illuminated the empty station, the world outside as hollow as the van itself. The code stuttered on over and over until my scribbles finally aligned into one clear, dreadful word: help. The van's interior shrank around me, and every instinct screamed to drive, to finish the journey, to follow orders, and never look back. But the knocks would not stop. They grew softer, slower, as if whatever voice remained was fading. The only question left was whether I would answer or leave the message unheeded, letting the storm carry it away into oblivion. For a moment, I sat paralyzed in the cab, the word help etched in trembling pen on the receipt in my lap, the storm's drumming fading behind the desperate code that now seemed to echo in my chest. Every instinct in me warred with every rule I'd ever learned. Never open a coffin in transit. Never deviate from the protocol. Never, ever let yourself believe that the dead might still have something to say. But the knocks persisted, weaker now but urgent, and I could no longer convince myself that this was the wind or the shifting road. Something inside that box wanted out, or wanted me to know what had been left unfinished. I restarted the engine and pulled away from the ruined gas station, torn between the orders that governed my profession and the haunting certainty that the journey had shifted beyond the world of paperwork and routine. As the van lurched back onto the highway, strange things began to happen. Lights flickered, the dashboard clock spun backward, the windshield wipers stopped mid-sweep, even as the rain grew heavier. Shadows seemed to dart at the edge of my vision, skittering in the corners of the rearview mirror, always vanishing before I could focus. Every song on the radio devolved into static and faint whispers, voices layered atop one another in a language I could not recognize. The back of my neck prickled, as if eyes were watching from the darkness behind the casket. The knocks had nearly faded now, replaced by a low, slow scraping, like fingernails on wood. I pulled over twice more, each time pacing in the rain, arguing with myself about the risk. What if it was all in my head? What if I lost my job? What if opening the box would make things worse? But the storm seemed to seal me in, the van becoming a liminal space between one world and the next. I began to speak aloud, promising whatever haunted the pine coffin that I was listening, that I wanted to understand, but the only answer was the silence growing heavier, the air thickening until I felt I might suffocate. By the time the crematorium's lights finally flickered into view distant, yellow, barely cutting through the storm, I knew I could not follow protocol. The decision was no longer mine to make. If I completed the journey as ordered, I would be complicit in silencing a plea that refused to die. The casket thudded one last time, softer than a heartbeat, and I understood. The living are sometimes the final witnesses to the unfinished stories of the dead. I would have to break the rules. I would have to face whatever waited within the box, because no road, no law, no ritual could drown out a message carried so far through darkness and rain from the other side. Rain hammered the parking lot as I rolled up to the crematorium's side entrance, every nerve on edge, the word help echoing in my mind, and the van thick with the residue of fear. For a moment, I sat frozen, headlights beaming into nothing, my breath fogging the glass, while thunder cracked overhead. The knocks from the coffin had stopped, replaced by a silence so dense I could barely force myself to move. But I owed it to the message, to the fragile human truth beneath all the rules. So I stepped out into the downpour, fumbled the back doors open, and stared at the simple pine box, now streaked with condensation and the ghostly memory of movement. My hands shook as I unlatched the casket, bracing for anything terror, accusation, or something far worse. Inside, there was no monstrous revelation, no impossible corpse sitting upright. Instead, lying beside the pale, perfectly still body was a sealed envelope and a worn silver locket, the metal chilled by the night. The envelope, smudged but intact, was addressed not to me, but to a woman's name I didn't know, the handwriting looping with sorrow and urgency. As I lifted the letter, I noticed faint scratch marks on the inside lid lines and dots, as if someone had tried to etch out their plea from within. I pressed my palm against the locket and felt, for just an instant, a warmth that did not belong to me. I carried both items inside, delivering them in secret to the attendant on duty, who promised to find the next of kin. There were no explanations given, no questions asked. In that moment, the world felt suspended, time slowed by the weight of secrets nearly lost, voices almost left unheard. When I returned to the van, the air had shifted. The silence was no longer suffocating, but tender, a hush left behind by something finally laid to rest. I drove home as dawn crept up over the sodden countryside, the rain easing into mist and the road behind me washed clean by the storm. I knew I could never tell the whole story. No supervisor or dispatcher would believe it, and the rules would never allow for what I'd done. But the message in the knocks had changed me, left an imprint I would carry on every midnight route, every lonely road between the living and the dead. Some journeys refuse to end, some voices refuse to fade, and some secrets demand witnesses. The casket's message was answered, the final request delivered, but I understood as I drove into the new day. The line between silence and memory is as thin as a coffin lid, and the echoes of unfinished stories never truly leave the ones who dare to listen. Story 3. There's a certain comfort to routine night shifts, a rhythm in the headlights sweeping over the same empty asphalt, the low thrum of the hearse engine, and the city's distant glow receding in the rearview. I'd driven the marginal road for years, always at odd hours, ferrying the departed from hospital to chapel, from chapel to rest, and I knew every bend and pothole by heart. Still, there was one stretch near the old river crossing that always felt different. Even in summer, a damp mist clung to the ground, crawling over the guardrails and swallowing the fields on either side. My colleagues shrugged it off, called it a low patch, but the fog there never truly lifted, no matter the season or time of night. It was on a Thursday late, closer to midnight than dusk, when the routine cracked for the first time. The weather had been unsettled all day, heavy clouds brooding above the city, but as I approached the foggy stretch, the mist thickened unnaturally, billowing against the windshield in pale, shifting waves. The headlights turned the world to milk and shadow. I slowed out of habit, eyes straining for movement. That's when I saw them, a line of people standing on the shoulder, all dressed in black. Their forms were perfectly still, heads bowed, hands clasped, faces indistinct beneath veils and hats. Not a single one moved as I approached. Not one turned away from the road. There must have been 20 or more, gathered close together, as if sheltering from a rain that hadn't fallen in years. Their presence was so absolute that for a heartbeat I wondered if I'd come upon an actual funeral, a procession lost in the night. But no cars stood parked nearby, no voices called out, only silence and the dense hush of the fog. As I crawled past, every figure lifted their head in eerie synchrony and turned to watch me through the glass, their faces empty of detail, yet somehow more present for it. Goosebumps prickled my arms. My breath misted in the chill, every instinct screaming to keep driving, not to look back. For the rest of the night, the memory haunted every turn. When I finished my shift, the sun already rising, I asked the dispatcher if anyone had reported a group out there, maybe a broken-down bus, a family in trouble, but no calls had come in. No one else had seen a thing. It should have ended there, another story for the break room. But as I would learn in the weeks to come, that stretch of fog and the silent crowd in black were just beginning to unravel the edges of my nightly routine. Sleep was hard to come by after that first encounter. Every Thursday night, as my shift approached, I felt a subtle tension coil in my gut, a sense of anticipation and dread I couldn't quite shake, no matter how many times I told myself it was just a trick of the light and nerves. Yet the marginal road was my regular route, and avoiding that foggy stretch would have meant rerouting dozens of grieving families and breaking a dozen more unspoken rules of the trade. So I kept driving it, week after week, but now with a growing sense that something in the mist was waiting for me, and only me. It didn't take long to realize that what I'd seen was no fluke. The very next Thursday, I approached the stretch near midnight, and the mist seemed to grow denser the closer I came. My headlights once again dissolved into white and shadow, and the chill inside the cab returned, prickling across my scalp. My hands tightened on the wheel. The figures were there lined up exactly as before, motionless at the roadside, a silent procession frozen in perpetual mourning. Each time I neared, their heads rose together, their faceless gaze turning to follow my passing, their presence heavy as stone on my chest. They never waved, never spoke, never moved to step onto the asphalt, just watched. I began to dread Thursdays. I stopped telling anyone about what I saw. The one time I tried to describe it to another driver, a grizzled old-timer, with a fondness for ghost stories, he only laughed, called it swamp lights, and swore he'd never seen anything stranger than a deer or an abandoned tire. A few colleagues started making jokes at my expense, but most just stared, uncertain, unwilling to engage. No one else reported a thing, even those who swore they drove that stretch every week. It was as if the fog and its moors were reserved just for me, bound to my route by some pact I'd never signed. I changed my routine, tried driving slower, faster, tuning the radio to static or talk shows, anything to break the spell. It made no difference. Each Thursday night, at precisely the same point, the procession appeared, as inevitable as sunrise and twice as cold. Sometimes the group seemed larger, sometimes smaller, but always dressed in black, always turned toward my passing lights, always vanishing in the rear view the instant I tried to stop or look back. The rest of the night would pass in a haze, my skin crawling, the memory of their silent, expectant faces gnawing at my nerves. Doubt crept in, the kind that blurs the line between exhaustion and something otherworldly. Was I imagining things? Was I the butt of some elaborate prank? Or was I, as the weeks passed and the fog grew thicker, the only living witness left for a funeral that refused to end? Each Thursday, I promised myself it would be the last yet every Thursday. There I was, headlights cutting through a wall of mist, driving past the silent mourners, who had begun to feel as much a part of my routine as the engine's hum and the quiet promise of dawn. It was the 9th Thursday when routine was broken by something living at least. That's what I believed as the old man climbed into the front seat just before midnight. I had stopped at the usual corner store for coffee, hands shaking as I fumbled for change, when he asked if I could give him a lift a few miles up the marginal road, close to the river. He was thin and weathered, his suit old-fashioned but carefully pressed, the kind of man you see at a wake and forget by the next morning. His eyes were sharp, gray as gunmetal, and there was a weight to his presence that made me hesitate. But the store clerk seemed to know him, and my route was lonely, so I unlocked the door and let him ride up front. We drove in silence for a while, the fog thickening outside as we drew near that haunted stretch. When the headlights began to bend and dissolve, I felt the old tension return, the chill at the base of my spine, prickling with foreboding. The old man gazed out the window, then leaned forward, his breath fogging the glass. "You see them too, don't you?" he said, voice so low, I almost missed it. I glanced at him, startled. He was watching me now, eyes bright with something that felt like pity or understanding. Without waiting for my answer, he began to murmur names, one after another, names that carried the rhythm of eulogies. Clara Hayes, Matthew Whitaker, Elsie Brewer, names I'd never heard, but struck some secret chord. He spoke of a tragedy, decades past, when a funeral procession crossing the river had been caught in the mist, derailed by a drunk driver, and swept away in the current. "The mourners never made it to the church," he whispered. "They've waited here ever since, Thursday after Thursday, for someone to finish the journey." A tremor ran through me. I gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles bone white. The van moving now through fog so dense, the world shrank to a single glowing tunnel. The old man's voice grew softer, distant, as if reciting a prayer. All they want is to be seen, to be remembered. But most drive by and never notice. He pressed something into my hand, a handkerchief, old and monogrammed, the embroidery almost worn away. When I looked up again, The seat beside me was empty. The door was locked, the window unbroken, and the fog ahead parted to reveal the familiar procession, the mourners in black, waiting and watching. My hands shook as I drove past, a handkerchief damp in my palm. I did not speak of the old man to anyone, but that night, and every Thursday after, his words lingered, carving themselves deeper into my memory. I began to wonder not if the mourners were real, but if perhaps I had joined their ritual. Another soul caught between dusk and dawn, bearing witness to a funeral that the living could not end. After that night, the handkerchief never left my pocket. I traced the faded initials with my thumb in quiet moments, half convinced I'd imagined the old man, but too haunted by his words to throw it away. Thursday after Thursday, the fog greeted me like a silent accomplice, the black-clad mourners materializing as if summoned by headlights alone. Their presence felt heavier, almost expectant, and I realized the story wasn't just about being seen. It was about a ritual that remained unfinished, a procession with no closure. I couldn't shake the need to know more. The next days were spent combing the city library's archives, scrolling through brittle microfilm and yellowed newsprint. It didn't take long to find the headline, "Tragedy on the River, Funeral Procession Lost in Fog." The article was dated from the early 1960s, telling of a hearse and 4 cars swept into the water after a truck struck them on the bridge late on a Thursday night. 11 people perished, most of them relatives and friends of the deceased. The reporter wrote that the funeral was never completed. The service at the church was postponed. The burial was held days later, in pouring rain, with only a single mourner present. The rest, the article said, had been lost to the river and the night. I returned to that stretch of road with new eyes. It made sense now, the mourners' patience, their unwavering vigil every Thursday. They were not haunting the living out of malice or longing. They were waiting for the end of a journey that fate had interrupted. No wonder no one else ever saw them. No one else carried their story, their burden. It had passed to me the moment I stopped to listen, the night the old man climbed into my cab and spoke the names. The more I drove the route, the heavier the obligation became. I noticed new details each time. A woman clutching wilted flowers, a young boy gripping his father's sleeve, an elderly couple standing slightly apart from the group, their faces etched with quiet sorrow. None moved, none spoke, but each radiated a quiet hope. They watched me week after week, as if weighing whether I might be the one to finally see them through. I realized then that the fog was less a curse than an invitation, a shroud for unfinished grief, waiting for someone willing to shoulder its weight. But what could I do? What could any driver do for the dead? The answer hovered in the mist, in the slow, sad turn of their heads as I passed, in the way the handkerchief grew softer with every handling, as if storing up memory for a final act of mercy. The night was coming when routine would not be enough, when the only way forward would be to stop, truly stop, and bear the burden the living had long since forgotten. The final Thursday arrived with a sky swollen dark and heavy, rain pouring down in sheets, the city's lights blurring to gold and gray in the rearview mirror as I made my way along the familiar route. The handkerchief was warm from my palm, an anchor against the uncertainty building in my chest. I drove slower than usual, the fog even denser, the world shrinking to the thin tunnel of my headlights and the steady, aching pulse of memory. Tonight, I told myself, would be different. The air carried the weight of decision, and as I neared the haunted stretch, I felt less a driver and more a participant in an old, unfinished story. When the mourners appeared this time, it was as if the whole world paused, the rain stilled, the mist stood motionless, and every figure was sharper in the beam, their faces drawn with longing and a hope that felt painfully human. For the first time, I stopped the hearse. I stepped out, the rain instantly soaking my suit, and walked into the wall of fog, heart hammering with fear and a strange sense of purpose. The crowd parted in silence as I approached, the mourners' eyes fixed on something behind them, a simple coffin resting on invisible hands, hovering just above the ground. No one moved to carry it. I understood then. They had been waiting for someone among the living to help finish what tragedy had left undone. I gripped the casket handles, my hands trembling as I lifted with effortless ease, the weight light as memory itself. The crowd followed in perfect silence, drifting through the mist like a true funeral procession, their forms flickering in and out of focus as we moved together toward a patch of earth just beyond the edge of the road. There, in the pouring rain, I set the coffin down. The mourners formed a circle, heads bowed, and for a moment the world held its breath. The old man from the cab stood among them now, hand on my shoulder, eyes bright with gratitude. A hush swept over the gathering, and then, as if released from a spell, the mourners faded one by one into the clearing air, their shapes dissolving into mist, the casket gently settling into the ground. When the last of them vanished, the fog lifted. The night grew still, the rain slowing, the road opening up before me in clean, moonlit silence. I returned to the hearse, the handkerchief now faded and threadbare, and drove away with the certainty that the procession had finally ended, that grief had crossed over. I never saw the mourners again, and in all the years since, that stretch of road has never known another Thursday fog, nor any passenger who watched in silence from the edge of memory, waiting for a ride that only I could give. Story 4. Night shifts were never easy, but there was a special kind of emptiness to the long stretch between the city hospital and the hillside cemetery. The clock on the dashboard flickered just after 2 a.m. as I steered the hearse onto the county road, headlights cutting a narrow path through pockets of fog and dew-soaked grass. The world was silent. The only sounds the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires over the cracked asphalt. Routine always helped confirm the paperwork, secure the casket, check the rear doors twice, then let the monotony lull the nerves. On this run, everything felt ordinary until it didn't. Halfway down the most deserted stretch, where trees leaned in close and the moonlight rarely reached the ground, I heard it, a low, wavering cry, like a child lost in the dark, rising from the compartment behind me. I froze, hands tightening on the steering wheel. At first, I thought it must be a trick of the wind. The whistle of air caught around the doorframe, but the sound grew clearer, more insistent and broken, pleading sob that made the hair on my arms stand straight. For a moment, I was paralyzed, mind racing to find a rational explanation. Maybe something had shifted inside the casket, a pressure change, a loose hinge, some natural settling of wood and fabric. But the crying didn't stop. Compelled by a dread that made my chest tight, I pulled onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the shudder of my own breath. For a long moment, I sat listening, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, waiting for the noise to fade or reveal itself as some unexplainable trick. Instead, the crying continued, softer now, but unmistakable, as if someone were weeping behind a closed door, just out of sight. I reached for the flashlight under my seat, the familiar weight giving me little comfort. My mind darted through every possibility, each one more impossible than the last. Maybe it was an animal trapped somewhere in the cargo area, maybe a radio left on by accident. But I knew, even before I slid from the driver's seat and stepped into the humid dark, that what I was about to find would make sense only to the part of me that believed in things I could never say aloud. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I circled to the back of the hearse, my hand trembling as I fumbled with the latch. I tried to steady my breath, telling myself this was just another odd night on the job, a story for the break room in the morning. But as the lock clicked open and the sobbing ceased, replaced by a silence so deep it rang in my ears, I knew that something fundamental had changed in the world behind me. My heart hammered as I pulled open the heavy doors, bracing myself for the source of the sobbing, expecting, against all reason, to see a casket shifted or broken, some plausible explanation. It could be retold and dismissed with a nervous laugh. Instead, I found the back of the hearse unnaturally still. The casket sat precisely where I'd strapped it, but the lid was slightly ajar, the lock twisted, as if forced from within or pried open by hands desperate and unseen. I hesitated, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I aimed it at the seam, dread swelling with every second. Slowly, I lifted the lid. The interior was empty. No body, no funeral blanket, Nothing but the impression of a form pressed into the satin lining, and the faintest trace of dampness, too much to be explained by the cool night air alone. My skin crawled. I stared at the void, numb, until a cold draft made me step back. The scent in the compartment was earthy, old, tinged with something sweet and rotten. A kind of smell you only notice in graveyards or forgotten cellars. Panic threatened to take hold. The official voice in my head insisted I had made a mistake, that the body must have shifted, that I was overtired, hallucinating, anything but what my senses reported. But then I caught sight of them, small, wet footprints, pressed into the thin film of condensation on the hearse's metal floor. They began at the edge of the casket, tracked in pairs to the rear bumper, and disappeared into the dark grass beyond the shoulder. The prints were fresh, damp mud clinging to the tread, each toe perfectly formed. They looked too small, too delicate, as if left by a child or someone who hadn't walked the earth in a very long time. My mouth went dry. I stepped into the beams of the taillights and shone my flashlight over the ground. There, leading away from the road and into the tangle of undergrowth, the footprints continued, weaving between rocks and wildflowers toward the dense, tangled brush at the forest's edge. The night pressed in close, thick with mist and a low hum of unseen insects, but nothing moved in the darkness. I called out a feeble, uncertain hello. It sounded thin even to my own ears, but only the hush of the woods answered back. Reason demanded that I get back in the van, lock the doors, and call for help. But something deeper, a gnawing mixture of terror and curiosity kept my feet planted, my eyes fixed on the trail, vanishing into the black. I knew, even as I weighed the dangers, that this night would not let me leave so easily. Whatever had left the casket and walked barefoot into the wild had a reason for calling out in tears, and it was up to me, alone in the dark, to follow where those wet, impossible footprints led. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, to lock the hearse and speed away, leaving whatever had slipped into the woods to the darkness and the rain. But the footprints called to something deeper, a sense of responsibility, or perhaps just a kind of dread curiosity that only those who work among the dead ever truly understand. Gripping my flashlight until my hand ached, I stepped off the shoulder and into the thicket, branches snapping beneath my boots, the wet grass soaking my pants to the knee. The woods swallowed the world behind me in seconds, the glow of the taillights fading to a dim memory. The footprints, so faint, yet unmistakable, pressed on ahead, weaving through the undergrowth, sometimes doubling back, sometimes vanishing beneath mats of moss, only to reappear a few feet ahead. The trees were dense here, older than the road itself, their trunks twisting up into a black canopy that shut out the sky. My flashlight caught glimpses of pale bark, glistening spiderwebs, and the occasional gleam of water pooled in the ruts of roots. I moved carefully, ears straining for any sign that I wasn't alone. For long minutes, all I heard was my own breath, ragged and thin, and the soft slap of wet shoes on mud. Then from deep ahead, the crying returned softer, but somehow closer, the same desperate, uneven sobs I'd heard in the van. I called out again, but my voice sounded swallowed by the trees. The crying broke into laughter high, warbling, wrong followed by a hush that chilled my skin. Then whispers, faint, layered, impossible to place, weaving in and out of the shadows. It was as if the woods themselves were repeating the sorrow of that night, the voices echoing not just the one I'd followed, but many, laughter and weeping, pleading and scolding, names that drifted through the branches and faded before they could reach my ears. At one point, I stopped, certain I felt a hand brush my shoulder, but when I spun, there was only the sweep of my own beam, trembling over empty trunks. My nerves frayed, I pressed on, drawn forward by the shimmering line of footprints that always seemed just a few steps beyond reach. The forest thickened, the air growing colder, the world behind me fading until only the next step mattered. As the path narrowed, the voices seemed to multiply, a chorus of longing and warning, an orchestra of the lost. My heart pounded with each step, sweat slicking my hands despite the chill. Still, I pressed on, deeper into the ancient, echoing gloom. knowing only that I would not leave until I faced whatever waited at the end of the trail. In that place between worlds, every sound was a test, every step a challenge, and behind every tree, I feared I might finally come face to face with the reason the dead sometimes do not rest, and the living cannot look away. The forest seemed endless, but at last the footprints led to a small clearing where the earth was soft and the air strangely still. There, beneath an ancient oak whose gnarled roots curled above ground like the fingers of something long buried, I saw the figure small, fragile, draped in the pale shroud that had wrapped the body I'd been meant to deliver. The figure stood facing the tree, back to me, shoulders shuddering with the rhythm of quiet sobs. My mouth was dry, fear knotting my tongue, but I forced myself forward, the beam of my flashlight wavering over the hunched silhouette. As I drew closer, the air thickened with a chill that no summer night should have carried. The laughter and whispers faded, replaced by a solemn quiet that pressed into my skull. I called out gently, voice shaking, "Are you lost?" The figure stilled and began to whisper names, soft, halting, a string of syllables that made no sense to me, but seemed charged with sorrow and memory. Mary, Jacob, Ruth, Simon. Each name fell from their lips like a prayer or an accusation. Some I almost recognized, snatches of obituary lists or stories from the hospital. Others belonged to strangers who had never made it to a grave. I knelt at the edge of the clearing, not daring to step closer, and listened as the figure wept and murmured, clutching at the bark with pale, trembling hands. With every name spoken, the woods seemed to tighten, the darkness itself drawing in as if to hear. I realized, with a dawning horror and pity, that the soul before me was not only mourning their own lost place, but also all those who had never been claimed or properly laid to rest. It was grief multiplied, a burden of names too heavy for one ghost or one living man to carry alone. A gust of wind flickered my light, and for a moment I caught the face and profile ashen, streaked with mud and tears, both impossibly old and heartbreakingly young. In their eyes was an endless, searching loneliness. My presence seemed to soothe them. The sobbing softened, the names trailed away, replaced by a whisper of thanks, so faint I almost believed I'd imagined it. The figure turned back to the tree and pressed its forehead to the trunk. The air warmed. The voices in the forest stilled. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to retreat, not out of fear, but out of reverence. I stumbled backward, the undergrowth giving way beneath my feet, my heart pounding as if I'd run miles. As I fled the clearing, the whisper of names faded behind me, replaced by a silence that felt almost peaceful, as though something lost had finally found a place to rest, if only for a moment, if only because someone living and afraid had stopped to bear witness. I crashed through the trees, the line between the world of the living and the world of the forgotten, now thinner than the membrane of a single breath. Branches whipped at my face and tangled my arms as I crashed out of the woods, heart pounding and lungs burning. The world outside the trees felt altered, heavier, the darkness now less a backdrop and more a living thing. The hearse stood exactly where I'd left it, the rear doors yawning open in the red haze of the taillights. Rain falling harder now, blurring everything into streaks of blood and shadow. For a long moment, I stood in the downpour, breathing in the cold air, trying to convince myself I hadn't lost my mind, hadn't followed footsteps into the woods, only to find something that couldn't exist. But the echo of that quiet gratitude, the litany of names, would not leave me. I approached the hearse slowly, my shoes squelching through new puddles. At first, I thought it was just rainwater streaked on the seats and the dashboard, but as I slid into the driver's seat, I froze muddy. Wet footprints marked the passenger floor and crept up onto the front seat. Impossible prints left by bare feet, toes splayed as if someone had sat beside me just moments before. On the console, a single pale handprint shimmered with water and dirt, pressed against the cracked plastic like a final signature. My hands shook as I touched it. The imprint was cold as the grave. In the rearview mirror, the reflection flickered my own face pale and drawn, but for a split second, another figure sat in the shadows behind me, the the shrouded shape I'd seen in the woods, eyes closed, mouth silent. I spun around, but the back was empty, only the open casket waiting, lid wide as a screen. The rain hammered the roof in time with my racing pulse. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had not returned alone. I slammed the doors, locked them tight, and drove faster than I ever had down the empty road, headlights slicing through a world that felt forever altered. The casket remained empty for the rest of the journey, the official forms signed and filed with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. No one at the cemetery questioned the silence or the time I'd lost. No one saw the wet footprints fading from the mat, the residue of something returned or released. But from that night on, the road never felt empty again. Every shadow in the rear view seemed to move with a mind of its own. Every sigh of the wind in the trees took on the cadence of whispered names. In the months that followed, on every midnight route, I felt the passenger seat grow colder, as if something unseen kept vigil by my side, a reminder that some stories don't end at the grave, and some burdens, once witnessed, become a part of you forever. Story 5. The graveyard shift is a quiet thing, the kind of quiet that settles behind your ribs and echoes in the empty roads stretched between the hospital and the mortuary. I'd grown used to the hush, to the sound of tires on wet asphalt, the low mechanical hum of the funeral van, and the steady ticking of the dashboard clock. On a Thursday in late autumn, fog rolled in early, turning the world into a blur of gray shadows. I was halfway between the city and the old Ridgeview Cemetery when the silence was broken, not by my own voice or some passing car, but by a sound rising from the van's radio, a faint wavering whisper, so soft it almost could have been the wind. The radio had been off. I was sure of it. I never listened to music on these runs. The stillness felt more respectful. Now, though, as I glanced at the dash, the orange dial glowed, and static curled through the speakers. Underneath the crackle, words seemed to tangle and slip, barely audible, threading through the static in a language I couldn't quite grasp. I reached to turn the radio off, but before my fingers touched the knob, the whisper faded away, leaving only the ordinary sound of the van and my own breath. At first, I told myself it was nothing, some passing interference, the kind that creeps into old wiring when you drive too far from town. But as I pulled through the cemetery gates and unloaded the night's cargo, I caught myself glancing at the radio again, half expecting the static to return. By the time the van was empty and the paperwork done, I'd almost managed to forget about it. Almost. The next night and the next. The whisper returned always when I was alone, always after midnight, the sound rising just above the threshold of understanding. I kept telling myself it was just the old vehicle, some trick of wires and time, but deep down, I felt it was more. Each time the static rose, so too did my unease, curling through my chest and making every shadow in the rear view stretch a little longer, a little darker. Soon I realized the pattern. The whispers only came when I was alone with the dead, only on roads that twisted between nowhere and nothing, only when the clock read a little after 2 and the world seemed to hold its breath. What started as static grew into something I couldn't ignore, a message, or maybe a warning, that the quiet of my nights would never be the same again. As the days slipped by, the whispers from the radio became more insistent, threading themselves through my every journey, growing bolder as if they were learning to speak with my unease. At first, they remained just out of reach, faint syllables, quick as moth wings, fading as soon as I turned my ear to them. But slowly, as the nights bled together and the fog grew thicker on the roads, the static shifted into language. I began to pick out fragments, strange, unfamiliar words, old cadences, phrases that pressed against memory without ever quite fitting into place. It was on a Monday, rain smearing the windshield, when the words came clear enough for me to recognize them. I had just passed the old mill outside of town, the air heavy with the scent of wet leaves and earth. The radio, which I'd turned off hours ago, flared to life with a crackle, and the voice that slid through the speakers was neither male nor female, young nor old, but somehow all of those things at once. The words were spoken softly, but each one carried a weight that seemed to fill the whole van. In ad eternum requiem, et veni et judicium, libera animum mean. The prayers were in Latin snatches of Mass for the dead, fragments about eternal rest, the day of judgment, the plea to deliver a soul from darkness. They came and went, sometimes so faint I thought I'd dreamed them, other times ringing clear as a church bell at midnight. The phrases grew longer each night, litanies and pleas, layered beneath the static as if multiple voices were weaving a tapestry of sorrow and hope. Some nights, the radio whispered lists of names in languages I'd never learned. Sometimes there were supplications, apologies, half-finished confessions. On 2 separate occasions, the words resolved into a melody so old and sad that I found tears streaming down my face before I even realized I was crying. It wasn't just the words, but the way they clung to the silence afterward. A lingering presence, a sense of unfinished business humming in the air long after the dial had gone dark. By the end of the week, I kept the radio unplugged, but it didn't matter. The voices found their way through the van's bones, through the hum of the engine and the pulse of my own heart. The Latin prayers returned, always circling around the same themes: rest, remembrance, release. They were not threatening, not exactly, but they were heavy and old and impossibly lonely. Each one pressed at the walls between worlds, asking for something I was no longer sure I could ignore. I began carrying a small digital recorder, the kind I'd used in college to catch lectures and reminders, thinking if I could just capture the voices, I might prove, if only to myself, that what I was hearing wasn't madness. The whispers continued to haunt every journey, but soon something shifted. One night, as the clock on the dash blinked 3 a.m., the static dissolved completely, and the voices took on a chilling clarity. At first, it was a murmur, like an old telephone left off the hook. Then, the conversation sharpened 2 voices overlapping, sometimes whispering together, sometimes at odds, their words thick with longing and regret. I listened, hands tight on the wheel, as the voices spoke names I'd never encountered, pulled fragments of stories that twisted through time. A lost child looking for her mother, an old man pleading for forgiveness, a young woman reciting prayers for a lover who never returned. Sometimes the voices argued softly, other times they spoke with the aching tenderness of people who had loved and lost everything, all of it impossible, none of it meant for living ears. And then, every night without fail, as the dashboard clock rolled over to exactly 3 a.m., the tone changed. No matter what came before, the voices stilled, and a single voice cracked, desperate, genderless and ageless, would break through with a plaintive, insistent plea. Help me. Don't forget me. Please, someone hear me. Sometimes it sobbed. Sometimes it shouted. Sometimes it pleaded in a dozen languages. But the message was always the same. A call for rescue, for remembrance, for release from a silence that went deeper than any grave. I listened to my recordings on nights off, always hoping to hear something mundane in the playback, a radio station bleeding through, a passing trucker on CB, some trick of the weather or the wires. But all I heard was static, broken by the faintest echoes, as if the living world could not carry the weight of what I'd witnessed in real time. Only in the hearse, only on that lonely road, did the voices truly come alive. It was as if, each night, I was the only one left awake in a world of sleeping souls, and as 3 a.m. approached, I was the only audience for stories that needed to be heard. Each marked hour carved deeper at my resolve. The pleas grew harder to ignore, the stories more vivid, until the line between passenger and driver, living and dead, began to blur. I started to realize that these were not merely echoes or tricks of failing machinery. They were messages, and each one was waiting for someone to answer. By the 3rd week, sleep had become impossible, each night haunted not just by the voices on the radio, but by the sense that my own presence had become entangled with the stories I was carrying. Every run to the cemetery felt heavier, every moment in the van more suffocating. I needed answers, anything to break the cycle that now ruled my nights. Between shifts, I pored over the van's maintenance logs, searching for rational explanations, faulty wiring, crossed circuits, even water damage. But the records were clean, and no technician found anything amiss. It was as if the voices had chosen this vehicle for reasons no one living could explain. Frustrated, I visited the local archives, scanning obituaries and burial records for the names I thought I heard through the static. Some matched the forgotten dead from decades past, patients with no family, drifters, those whose funerals had been quick and lonely. Others never appeared in any book. The cemetery's caretaker, a man who'd worked there longer than anyone, shook his head when I pressed him for ghost stories. "You hear things out there," he said, "but the dead only stay restless when there's something left unfinished." My last attempt for understanding brought me to a nearby rectory. I described what I'd heard to a priest, careful not to sound mad. He listened in silence, eyes troubled, and told me that prayers in Latin were sometimes used for souls who had no one left to pray for them, especially those lost or unclaimed. "When remembrance fails," he said, "sometimes the soul seeks anyone willing to listen." Armed with this knowledge, I replayed the recordings again and again, straining for meaning in the sea of static and pleas. I realized, with mounting dread, that the voices grew sharpest on the nights when I transported those who had died without visitors John Does. Jane Does, the aged and forgotten. It wasn't coincidence. The hearse itself had become a vessel, not just for bodies, but for memories, for griefs that refused to be buried. The next night, as 3 a.m. drew near, the static returned with a vengeance. This time, though, I was ready. I slowed the van to a stop beneath the halo of a street lamp, the cemetery gates looming ahead, and waited as the voices rose Latin prayers, desperate names, the familiar, aching plea for help. With my hands shaking, I whispered each name I could remember, offered a prayer for the unknown, and promised aloud that I would not let them fade. For a heartbeat, the static stilled, the radio silent as a held breath. I knew then that I had become a witness, a keeper of the final message that the world had forgotten. But I didn't know if my part in the story was over, or if the hearse would ever let me go. The next night, as midnight slid quietly into morning, and my latest run drew me toward the old city cemetery, I felt the familiar chill of anticipation coil inside my chest. The radio had been silent through the first leg of the drive, the van's interior thick with that deep, reverent quiet that only comes when the living keep company with the dead. But as I passed the empty park and the cracked old sign by the chapel, the digital clock blinked to 2:59, and I knew what was coming. I slowed the van, parked beneath a pool of yellow light, and waited, my hands tight on the wheel. The static rose soft as breath, barely more than a shimmer beneath the hum of the engine. Then, right on cue, the whispers blossomed into desperate voices' pleas for help, names and prayers tumbling over one another, the insistent, aching need not to be forgotten. I sat still, listening to every voice, every story, every word I could understand, and many I could not. When the clock turned to 3:01, I did the only thing left. I bowed my head and spoke. I named each soul I remembered from the archives, each lost patient and drifter and nameless case, each person who'd passed through my care without a final visitor. I recited a prayer halting, imperfect, stitched together from the Latin I'd heard and the scraps of comfort I remembered from childhood. I promised, softly, fiercely, that I would not let them vanish, that as long as I drove the night, they would have a witness. The effect was immediate. The static wavered, faded, and then for the first time in weeks, the radio fell utterly silent. Not the silence of loneliness or neglect, but a peace that felt deep and bright, something that pressed a gentle weight over my shoulders and filled the van with a hush more profound than any words. I sat there for a long time, unable to move, unsure if I'd crossed some line or finally found my way home. After that night, the radio rarely spoke out of turn, but every so often, on the loneliest runs, I would catch a faint whisper, a name half remembered, or a prayer in the dark. I came to understand that the work of remembering is never finished, that the souls who pass through our hands never truly vanish if someone keeps their story alive. And so I keep driving through fog and rain and silence, knowing that sometimes all a restless soul needs is to be heard, if only for a moment, before the static finally gives way to peace. Story 6. There's a certain numbness that comes with the late-night drives along straight highways bathed in the pale sweep of headlights. Silence pressed in close between the slow tick of the dashboard clock and the muted thrum of the hearse's engine. That night felt no different. The city long vanished behind me, the sky draped in a heavy veil of cloud that blotted out the moon. I checked the casket, signed the forms, set my route for the cemetery on the edge of town. The only company I expected was the faint scent of lily and the quiet creak of the van's suspension as I rolled over every bump and pothole. Halfway through the journey, somewhere on a forgotten stretch of road where even the stars seemed afraid to look down, I reached for my coffee and found something wedged in the seat beside me. A piece of paper creased, soft with wear, edges trembling as if it had passed through too many hands. I frowned, thinking it was just an old receipt or a scrap of delivery paperwork. But when I unfolded it under the glow of the dash, my blood ran cold. The message was scrawled in a shaky, frantic hand. Please, don't let them bury me. Don't let them close the lid. I'm not ready. The ink had smudged in places, letters crowding each other as if written in a hurry or with trembling fingers. I stared at it, the words seeping into the marrow of my bones, colder than the air outside. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe a sick joke from the guys at the funeral home. Maybe a note left over from another job. Some morbid prank to unsettle new drivers. But the handwriting was unfamiliar, desperate in a way that felt too real to be staged. I read the note twice, 3 times, as if meaning might slip between the lines. The plea was direct, almost childish in its terror, and yet strangely formal. I glanced back at the casket, still closed, still motionless, still holding its secrets in the rear compartment. An involuntary shudder crept down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence. I stuffed the note into the glove box, told myself it was just the long hours and the weight of solitude warping my senses. But as I drove on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The words followed me, looping through my head, echoing with every mile and every sigh of wind along the empty road. Don't let them bury me. Don't let them close the lid. The night seemed to stretch even longer, each shadow in the mirror a little darker, each silence a little heavier. I didn't know it yet, but that single crumpled note was only the beginning of something I couldn't have imagined, and certainly couldn't outrun. Sleep never came easy after that night, not with the memory of the note prickling at the back of my mind, nor with the echo of its plea shadowing every turn of the wheel. The following evening, I tried to shake it off, telling myself to stay sharp, that a little fear was just part of the job. The route was the same, the client's family tearful but polite, the casket loaded and secured with the practiced care of routine. But the air in the hearse felt heavier, as if some invisible presence watched each of my movements, waiting for my attention to waver. I was halfway through cleaning out the back seats when my fingers brushed against something brittle beneath the floor mat. Another piece of paper, folded small and thin as a secret. My hands trembled as I opened it. Another message, this one even shorter, but unmistakably in the same jittery, desperate handwriting. Don't let them do it. Please, don't close it. The ink was smeared, a small blot of water at the edge, as if a tear had fallen mid-sentence. My chest tightened. I tried to remember if anyone had access to the hearse overnight, but the garage was always locked. Maybe it had slipped down during the previous drive. I reasoned, yet the first note was still in the glove box, untouched. I searched the car with growing dread. Under the driver's seat, tucked into a corner of the console, wedged deep in the pocket of my uniform jacket, more notes, each pleading in that same unmistakable hand. Don't put me in the ground. I can hear them coming. Tell them to wait, please. Some notes were barely legible, the letters crowding together as if written in panic. Others were oddly calm, the lines neat and evenly spaced, but the request always the same. It felt as though the words themselves were multiplying, crawling into every crevice of the car, waiting for me to find them. By the third day, the routine of work had unraveled into paranoia. I began checking every pocket and compartment before each shift, expecting and dreading what I might find. My colleagues noticed the change, but chalked it up to exhaustion, joking that the night runs were finally getting to me. I smiled and played along, but my hands were always shaking, my eyes always searching for the next scrap of desperate plea. Each new note made my skin crawl with the certainty that someone or something was trying to reach me from a place just beyond understanding. It was more than a prank. It was a pattern. The same trembling hand, the same unending request, the same insistence that I do what no funeral worker should ever consider. And as I drove the familiar routes through the city's sleeping heart, every glance in the mirror felt like an invitation to look deeper, to see what waited beneath the surface of routine and ritual. The lines between my duty and the dead were blurring, and I could no longer pretend that the messages were just the work of chance or mischief. Something wanted to be heard, and it wasn't going to stop. The mounting collection of handwritten notes weighed on me until sleep became impossible, and every new shift was heavy with dread. By the end of the week, I had amassed a fistful of scraps, all penned with the same desperate energy. Unable to focus on anything else, I set them out in a line across my kitchen table, smoothing each trembling plea beneath the harsh kitchen light. Every note carried that same strange mix of formality and panic, the loops and slants of the script familiar now, as if I had read a diary in reverse, each message a plea caught between resignation and terror. Haunted by the idea that these notes had a source I might trace, I dug through the old transfer logs in the garage office. There were names, ages, hospital forms, even a few archived letters for families unable to claim their dead. Among the faded records, I found the intake for a recent case, a Mr. Samuel Wright, age 74, cause of death, cardiac arrest, but with a thick file of legal complaints attached. The handwriting in the attached medical authorization stumbling, crowded, shaky matched perfectly the frantic script of the notes. I compared them side by side, heart thudding. There was no doubt. It was his. My mind reeled with what this meant. I remembered the transfer. The family had argued bitterly at the hospital, voices raised just outside the prep room, accusations slung through gritted teeth about inheritance, nursing home abuse, and decisions made without consent. I remembered, too, how quiet the old man had seemed in the casket, mouth parted as if to speak one final word that no one had time to hear. The death certificate said one thing, but the story swirling around the body felt unfinished, angry, unresolved. I started to suspect the notes weren't just a plea against burial, but a warning, a last desperate attempt to avoid an injustice or a secret carried to the grave. As the realization sank in, the presence in the hearse felt heavier, as though every run was not only a delivery, but an unwilling partnership with the restless, aggrieved dead. I thought about what I'd overheard. A daughter who wouldn't look at the casket, a son who refused to help with the arrangements, the way no one lingered at the viewing, everyone eager to be done with the old man, to close the lid and walk away. The messages took on new urgency. Please, someone listen. Don't let them do it. I need to speak. The fear in the notes became my own, threading through each sleepless night. I knew then that I was caught in the middle of a story that wasn't finished, a request that would haunt every mile of my route until someone, somehow, finally listened. By the day of the funeral, the line between responsibility and obsession had blurred completely. I could hardly tell if I was acting out of duty to the living or the dead. The hearse was spotless, but my hands shook as I checked every compartment. No new notes, but my pockets were still full of them, desperate reminders pressing against my chest. The weather was gray and oppressive, as if the sky itself waited in anticipation, and even the cemetery seemed unusually silent as the mourners gathered beneath the tent. I found myself searching their faces for any sign that they felt what I did, any hint of regret or uncertainty. The family's voices were low, hushed, wary, eyes flicking over the coffin but never meeting mine. The officiant hurried through the rites, voice dull and practiced, and the pallbearers shifted restlessly as the service neared its end. With each passing minute, the notes in my pocket seemed to grow heavier, the pleas more urgent. Don't let them close the lid. Please, not yet. As the time came for the final viewing, I hesitated at the rear doors. My mouth was dry, my throat tight. I tried to speak, forcing out a halting explanation, fumbling for words that might convince them to wait, to reconsider, to listen to the last wishes I'd found scattered through the hearse. "There's something you should know," I said, voice thin and unsteady. "I've been finding notes. Requests not to be buried, not to close the casket, I think." But my words died in the air. A cousin snorted. The daughter rolled her eyes. The son muttered that it was all just a trick of nerves or someone's idea of a sick joke. The officiant shook his head and called for the pallbearers. Ridiculed, dismissed, I felt smaller with every breath. Someone told me I was overtired, that I should go home after the service. No one wanted to hear about a dead man's handwriting or the impossible requests of the recently departed. As the family filed by, the daughter threw a last, cold look at the casket. The son checked his phone, and the lid was slowly lowered, the final click sealing the box with a soft, unyielding finality. In that moment, the air grew heavier, the wind stilling, and the silence seemed to settle over the grave like a curse. I lingered as the mourners drifted away, unable to shake the feeling that something irretrievable had just been lost. The weight in my pockets felt like lead, the voices in the notes now joined by a hush so thick I could barely breathe. I drove away from the cemetery with a distinct sense that the last plea had gone unheard, and that a story which had ached to be told was now sealed under earth, waiting for the next restless midnight to try again. That night, sleep refused to come. I tossed and turned, the notes scattered across my nightstand like a vigil of desperate voices. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the casket's lid sealing shut, heard the soft finality of that click, and felt a suffocating presence thickening the air around me. The silence in the house grew dense, punctuated only by the sigh of wind at the window and the slow, arrhythmic beat of my heart. I wanted to believe the worst was over, that the burial, however cold and unceremonious, had ended the haunting. But as the hours stretched toward dawn, I knew something had shifted, and not for the better. The next shift started like any other, but the hearse felt colder inside, shadows longer, and the air perpetually damp, no matter how high I turned the heater. As I pulled away from the funeral home, the dashboard clock flickered, and the radio stuttered with static just for a moment. A faint whisper, a voice I recognized, but could not name. Doors creaked, sometimes locking themselves, and the lights in the rear compartment flickered, as if shuddering at every bump in the road. Whenever I glanced at the rearview mirror, the shape of the casket seemed to hover there, even when the back was empty. At times, it was as if the van carried more than just the living, as if the weight of one final ignored plea had imprinted itself in the very metal and fabric of the vehicle. More than once, when I parked the hearse in the moonlit lot behind the garage, I would find a fresh note on the dashboard, never when anyone else was watching, always folded small, always the same trembling hand. They no longer begged, but accused. "You didn't listen. Why did you let them close it?" "No, I will wait." Each new message chilled me, a silent reminder that the cost of dismissal was not mine alone to bear. Sometimes on the drive home, the air would fill with the faintest hint of lily and earth, and the seat beside me would seem just a shade too occupied. As days became weeks, the house itself was not immune. I'd wake to doors softly closing, to the rustle of paper in empty rooms, to whispers that rose and faded with the night wind. Even in crowds, I felt watched by the echo of a plea, by the memory of hands that trembled with the fear of burial. I knew then that the stories of the dead do not die with them, not if their last wish is left unheard. In the silence that followed, I learned the true weight of a request denied. It lingers, restless, until someone finds the courage to listen. And so, each night, I wait too, hoping that the next plea for mercy will find open ears before the silence grows too heavy to bear. Story 7. It was supposed to be a routine morning delivery, a kind of job that had become muscle memory after years behind the wheel. Paperwork double-checked, the hearse polished to a shine, the casket carefully loaded and strapped in place. The destination was Millstone Cemetery, a patch of land older than the city itself, with gates that creaked and monuments pitted by decades of rain. I'd been there before its rows of leaning stones and ancient trees held the same solemn quiet as any burial ground. But the air that day felt different, thick with a tension I couldn't name. As I rolled up to the wrought iron entrance, the morning sky was a pale gray, fog curling low along the fence line. The staff was already waiting near the chapel, heads bowed, ready to get on with the business of saying goodbye. I slowed the hearse, swung wide for the gate, and felt the oddest shudder run through the car, as if the earth itself resisted my arrival. The instant my front wheels crossed the threshold, a sharp pop rang out. The hearse jerked to one side. I swore under my breath, heart sinking as I stepped out to find the front tire flattened, the rubber already deflating against the gravel with a defeated hiss. There were no nails, no glass, no debris, nothing but the sudden, inescapable sense of being unwelcome. The funeral director shot me a wary look, his hands clasped tight behind his back. "We've had more trouble with this gate than usual lately," he muttered, but his eyes darted to the cemetery groundskeeper, who only shook his head and busied himself with the flower arrangements. Everyone seemed eager to move quickly, to get the burial over with and return to the world outside those rusted gates. I struggled with despair, sweat beading on my brow even in the chill. Every minute spent fighting with the jack and lug wrench felt watched by the staff, by the mourners waiting in the chapel, and by something else, invisible, deeper in the maze of ancient stones. When I finally managed to unload the casket and wheel it to the plot, the clouds had thickened overhead, the wind picking up to moan through the twisted branches. The director rushed the service, the prayers barely audible over the growing howl. And as soon as the casket was lowered, everyone scattered, no lingering, no small talk, no one looking back. Back at the hearse, patching the tire in the lingering fog, I tried to tell myself it was all coincidence, just bad luck and nerves wound too tight. But as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the gates now swinging slowly shut. And for a split second, I thought I saw the groundskeeper watching me from the shadow of the arch, lips moving in a silent warning. This place doesn't want you here, and neither does the ground. After that first disastrous morning at Millstone, I found myself dreading every call from the dispatch office with a delivery headed to that cemetery. Still, the work went on, and the calendar seemed cursed to put me on shift for every next attempt. Each time a new body was scheduled for Millstone, I felt the same low knot of dread tightening in my chest. And each time, something went wrong, never the same way twice, but always just as I pulled up to the black iron gate or crossed onto the gravel drive. On my second visit, the hearse's battery died without warning the moment I parked at the entrance. The engine, which had run smooth as silk the whole drive, stuttered once and fell silent. No amount of coaxing or jump-starting would bring it back to life. I ended up waiting nearly 2 hours for a tow truck while the funeral director paced in frustration and the mourners retreated to their cars, some muttering about ill omens and the disrespect of delays. When the mechanic finally got the hearse started, the clock had turned, the day gone sour, the burial rushed and unsettled. The next week, heavy rain pelted the city. Still, Millstone sat dry under a patch of stubborn blue sky until the moment I pulled through the gate. Then, as if some unseen dam had broken, a deluge poured down, drenching the grounds in seconds. The roads turned slick, mud sucked at my boots, and the pallbearer struggled to carry the casket without slipping, all the while thunder rumbled in a sky clear just beyond the cemetery wall. The priest gave up trying to be heard over the storm, his blessing lost in a wind that tore at the tent and sent chairs tumbling. By the third attempt, the pattern was undeniable. On that day, as I idled at the gate, the iron bars refused to budge. No amount of pushing, key turning, or even the help of the grounds crew could unlock them. We ended up passing the casket over the fence, a spectacle that left everyone shaken and glancing sideways, as if worried the ground itself might open and swallow us for the indignity. Rumors spread among the funeral home staff. Some said it was the weather, others blamed poor maintenance or the age of the site, but a few began to whisper that Millstone had never been right, that it had filled up long ago with stories better left unspoken. The groundskeepers stopped meeting my eyes, and the older men always had an excuse to be somewhere else when a new burial was scheduled. Each accident built on the last, a slow growing certainty that it was not chance at all, that the land itself refusing to accept what we brought. The very gate grown stubborn in its duty to keep the living and the dead apart. With every failed delivery, the burden of dread grew heavier. Even in daylight, the shadows in Millstone seemed to lengthen as I approached, the old stones leaning just a little more, as if listening for the sound of my tires on the gravel. I knew then that the accidents were only the beginning, that something within those iron gates did not just resist the living, but rejected the dead as well. After weeks of mounting failures and mishaps, a pattern of avoidance settled into the funeral home. Millstone jobs rotated to newer drivers or landed back in my lap with uneasy shrugs. Nobody wanted the assignment, but someone always had to go. The seasoned drivers kept their distance, their glances wary whenever the old cemetery came up. Whispers grew in the break room, stories swapping hands like currency after dark. Some laughed, saying the place was just unlucky ground, but others lowered their voices to share the real reasons they avoided Millstone. Tales of burials gone awry, graves that wouldn't stay filled, and a chill that clung to anyone who lingered too long beyond sunset. It was on one of those restless, fog-choked mornings that I finally met the cemetery's oldest watchman, Mr. Hobbs, a wiry man with a face creased by sun and sorrow, who had tended Millstone's grounds since before most of the headstones had names. He found me cursing the gate as it jammed for the third time in a month, my patience worn thin by another inexplicable delay. Hobbs leaned against the post, arms folded, his expression unreadable. "You can wrestle with that gate all you like, son," he said quietly, "but this ground's already made up its mind." I forced a smile, blaming bad luck and old hinges, but he shook his head. "It's not the hardware, it's the soil. Millstone was sealed years ago, after they buried old Florence Green back when folks still thought rules mattered. That was the last one this place accepted, and I think she took the last space herself. Every new casket since then has brought nothing but trouble." He cast his gaze over the weathered stones, voice low and grave. "We tried to dig a fresh grave once, back in '93. The earth closed over our shovels. Next day, the whole spot was as smooth as if nothing had ever been disturbed. Others tried at night, hoping to outsmart the place, ended up with broken ankles, busted tools, even a lightning strike once. Some say Florence's spirit walks the rows, counting the markers, and when she gets to her own, she locks the gate tight. That's her way of keeping Millstone full, no more sorrow, no more room." I listened, half disbelieving, half wishing I could laugh. But the look in Hobbs's eyes was cold and earnest, a warning older than any rusted padlock. "You'll hear stories from the others," he continued. "Don't ignore them. This ground keeps its own company, and it remembers who tries to force their way in." From then on, even the sound of my own footsteps on Millstone's gravel seemed to echo with the watchman's words. The gate felt heavier, the air colder, every accident now seeming less like random chance and more like a deliberate, silent refusal. And I knew, with the certainty of a bad dream you can't quite wake from, that the next time I tried to deliver the dead to Millstone, the cemetery itself would fight back, not out of malice, but out of some ancient, exhausted need to keep itself undisturbed. Determined to see the job through, if only to prove I hadn't lost my grip on reality, I agreed to one final delivery to Millstone. The assignment came late, a storm already building on the horizon, thunder rolling in like a warning. I drove through rain that blurred the world to streaks of silver, the hearse rattling with every gust of wind as I approached the cemetery gates. Even before I stopped, I felt the pressure in the air, a kind of resistance that seemed to push against the vehicle itself, daring me to try. The gate, always stiff, wouldn't move in all this time. I left the hazard lights blinking, trudged through ankle-deep puddles, and with the help of a single brave groundskeeper, forced it open just enough to squeeze through. As I backed the hearse in, the storm's fury reached its peak. Lightning split the sky. Thunder cracked so close it shook the stones. Branches fell, blocking the path behind me, and as we wrestled the casket onto the cart, our flashlights flickered, then died. In the darkness, the only sound was the wind and a rising chorus of whispers I could not place rustling through the headstones, threading between the rows. I heard my own name, once, twice, then lost it in a tide of voices that hissed, "No more, no more." Equipment failed. The wheels on the casket cart locked up, refusing to roll further into the cemetery. Our shovels struck roots where there were never roots before, the earth packed so tight it might as well have been concrete. Rain turned the soil to slick clay, swallowing our boots. The groundskeeper's flashlight rolled into an open grave and was instantly snuffed out. We stood shivering, soaked, faces streaked with mud, the casket refusing to budge as if it were held in place by a dozen unseen hands. Then the wind dropped just for a moment. I thought I saw shapes moving among the tombstones. Shadows, or perhaps something more, faces turned away, backs hunched against the storm. The message was clear. This place is full. We don't want company. Leave while you can. The groundskeeper, pale and shaking, grabbed my arm. We have to go. Now. As we scrambled back to the hearse, the gate slammed shut behind us, the clang ringing through the storm like a warning bell. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the road, the casket still in the rear, the air in the car thick with the scent of wet earth and something sour resentment, perhaps, or sorrow. That night, as the rain lashed against my windows and the sky burned with the memory of lightning, I knew the truth of the legends. Millstone had refused another soul, and the living were lucky to have escaped with nothing worse than a story. But some stories, I realized, have a way of following you home, clinging to your skin long after you leave the cemetery gates behind. No one spoke much at the funeral home after that night. The casket that Millstone refused remained in the cold room for 3 days, as calls were made and alternate arrangements debated in hushed tones. The other drivers found excuses to avoid the run. Even the embalmers kept their distance, eyes flicking warily to the back wall where the rejected rested, as if expecting something to change in the air. I felt it too, an unease that grew with each passing hour, as though the dead man inside was waiting for news that would never come. By the end of the week, word had spread through the city's funeral circuit. Every corpse that Millstone rejected found a fate worse than the ordinary hush of burial. A driver who tried to force a burial despite the omens developed a fever and never drove again. One family, desperate for closure, insisted on a midnight burial. The grave flooded within hours, casket washed up by morning, lid battered, and soil black as ink. Even the local newspaper ran a cautious piece, headlined, "Old Cemetery Closed to New Burials? Maintenance or Mystery?" But those of us who had worked there knew it was neither. It was the ground itself exhausted, haunted, unwilling to take on another sorrow. Rumor held that the earth at Millstone was sealed after that final mysterious interment. Some said the plot was never marked. Others claimed the ghost of Florence Green, or whoever sealed the ground, walked at night, keeping count, watching for trespassers. The soil there was restless, eager to defend its peace, lashing out at those who tried to challenge its limits. The curse, if it could be called that, was not showy or cruel, just insistent. No more. Not here. I never again took a delivery to Millstone, nor did most of the staff. The cemetery gates, rusted and overgrown, became a boundary few dared to cross. Sometimes, driving late at night, I would glance in the rear view and think I glimpsed old Mr. Hobbs at the entrance, nodding to himself in the darkness, keeping his silent vigil. Every so often, I'd hear of another cemetery refusing a grave, a town somewhere else where the earth rebelled, and I'd shiver, knowing that sometimes even the dead must wait for a place to rest. In the silence that followed Millstone's last rejection, the ground kept its peace, and the living learned to listen to what the land refused to accept, because not every story needs another ending, and some soil, at last, must remain undisturbed. Story 8. Rain streaked the windshield in silver lines, distorting the world outside until even the city lights looked like distant, melting lanterns. The funeral home was nearly silent at that hour, the living long gone, and only the ticking of the wall clock and the hush of the refrigeration units keeping time. I was sorting paperwork, thinking of nothing but the drive home, and the call came. No caller ID, no name, just a flat, static-filled voice instructing me to prepare a body for transport. The paperwork, already printed, waited on the counter, as if someone had known I'd be working late. The address, handwritten at the top, was one I'd never seen before, 1217 Marrow Lane. I searched the system for Marrow Lane, nothing. Checked the city database, scrolled through my phone's maps, even tried an online search. No such street appeared in any record, not in this town, not in any town nearby. Yet when I typed the address into the GPS, the device chirped with a cheerful certainty and generated a route. The screen's synthetic voice announced the drive would take 40 minutes, and every turn glowed green as if the road had always been there. A chill settled over me as I loaded the casket. The staff on duty avoided my eyes, and for a moment I considered calling the manager, asking for backup, refusing the job outright. But protocol was protocol, and there were always strange runs in this line of work. Besides, the city was full of dead-end streets and addresses that lingered only in the memories of those who lived long enough to see them renamed or forgotten. I pulled the hearse out into the storm, wipers thudding back and forth, GPS glowing pale in the dark cab. The route was simple at First Take Main. Cross the bridge, head past the parked familiar streets. If lonelier than usual in the late hour, but a strange sense of anticipation rode with me, like a second presence in the car, watching the screen just as closely as I did. Every time I glanced at the paperwork, the address seemed to shimmer, as if the ink hadn't yet dried. The GPS showed Marrow Lane, stretching out ahead of me, a promised destination on a map that no longer felt like it belonged to the city I knew. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever waited at the end of this drive was not meant for the living, and that I'd already crossed an invisible line the moment I accepted the order. The rain kept falling as I left the familiar grid of the city behind, guided only by the unwavering confidence of the GPS, its glowing arrow inching along a purple line that wound deeper and deeper into the unknown. At first, the streets were ones I knew: Elm, Willow, Pritchard. I left on Carter, but they seemed emptier than ever, the lamplight blurring on the wet pavement, each intersection swallowed by the mist. Block by block, the world lost its texture. Houses faded behind curtains of rain. Traffic lights blinked through fog to signal an emptiness that pressed close on all sides. My headlights picked out only puddles and the glint of water on cracked asphalt. Then things began to shift. Street signs became scarce, or so rusted and overgrown with ivy I couldn't read them even when I rolled to a stop and squinted through the rain. The GPS announced a turn onto Pine Hollow, but the street marker was missing. The houses on the corner boarded up, windows black and blank as eyes. I checked my mirrors, half expecting to see someone following, but there were no other cars. No movement anywhere, only my own reflection, drawn and anxious, in the blue-lit cab. With every mile, the GPS grew more erratic. The map zoomed in and out of its own accord, recalculating and spinning in circles. Sometimes, as I drove, the route would vanish entirely for a moment, leaving only a blank gray field, the arrow lost and shivering before blinking back with a new direction, a new street that didn't match what I saw outside the window. At one intersection, the voice chirped, "Turn right on Marrow Lane." But where the road should have been was nothing but a stand of old trees and a crumbling wall. I kept going, heart thudding, hoping for a cross street or a landmark I recognized. But each turn led to stranger roads: sunken court, hollow path, lantern's end. Worse still, the world outside seemed to dissolve the further I drove. The rain thickened, swallowing the city behind me, while the GPS offered up directions to places I was certain did not exist, roads that curved in impossible ways, looping back on themselves or ending abruptly at chain-link fences or fields that stretched out into darkness. Occasionally, I would spot a street sign, slick with rain, but as I tried to read it, the letters seemed to change, rearranging themselves into names that made no sense or faded into nothing at all. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly, my knuckles ached, and every shadow on the edge of the road looked like a warning. The further I went, the more the city fell away behind me, until it felt like I was driving not just out of town, but out of time. The world reshaping itself around the path set by the address I was never meant to find. It didn't matter how many times I tried to break the pattern. At every intersection, I thought if I just took a different turn, ignored the GPS, or retraced my steps, I might find my way back to the city, or at least somewhere familiar. But the roads had stopped obeying any map. Every detour led me deeper into a maze of empty lots and rain-soaked, nameless lanes. Eventually, I stopped trusting the directions altogether and tried to navigate by instinct, squinting for any landmark, any sign that I was moving forward. Still, the further I drove, the more each street resembled the last. Every set of trees lining up in the same unnatural curve, every boarded-up house staring blankly back at me through the downpour. Then, with a sick drop in my stomach, I realized the same buildings and potholes were repeating subtle differences at first. A mailbox on the wrong side of the street, a lamppost flickering with a stutter that I was sure I'd already passed twice before. The GPS, now little more than a talisman glowing in the dark, started to betray me outright. Sometimes it showed my position hovering in gray nothingness, the purple route circling endlessly, or it would freeze altogether before snapping back to life with the same directions I'd heard an hour earlier. Turn left on Merrill Lane, it insisted, again and again, each time into streets that folded back into themselves, guiding me in a slow spiral that always returned to where I'd started. After the third or fourth loop, who could say how many, I found myself back at the funeral home's own rear gate. The rain still lashing the windshield, the city's skyline barely a memory beyond the mist. The clock said it was just after midnight, but I knew in my bones that more time had passed, that I'd been driving for hours in circles with no witness but the body in the back and the storm that never eased. I stepped out into the rain, trying to catch my breath, to prove to myself that the night air was real and not some fever dream of exhaustion and nerves. The lot was empty, the building locked and dark. Yet for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the windows, a flicker of a shadow, a suggestion of someone watching. When I climbed back into the driver's seat and restarted the engine, the GPS chirped as if nothing had happened, ready to send me back out to Merrill Lane, its voice as bright and empty as ever. That's when the dread set in for good. No matter what I did, the city would always pull away, the map would always unravel, and I would always return to where I'd begun, caught in a loop with no exit, driving a funeral that could never reach its destination. Each cycle left the world a little quieter, the sky a little darker, and the boundaries of reality thinner with every turn of the wheel. By the time I accepted there was no breaking the loop by willpower or luck, the world inside the hearse began to change. Each return to the starting point left the cabin colder, the windows fogged from the inside, despite the heater running on high. My breath hung visible in the air, a chill settling into my bones that felt deeper than anything the rain could explain. I tried to tune out the fear, focusing on the steady pulse of the wipers, the hypnotic rhythm of the storm. But the stillness behind me grew heavier, pressing at my neck like a hand. That's when the voices began. At first, they were nothing but murmur words, impossible to catch, little more than the hum of static or wind through the frame. Yet the more I tried to ignore them, the clearer they became. Sometimes it was a whisper, a plea, a question in a voice I'd never heard. Sometimes it was a name, spoken as if it belonged to someone who'd been waiting for far too long. The air itself vibrated with meaning, as if the hearse had become a vessel, not just for a body, but for every story the city had ever forgotten. One loop led into another. Now and then, the casket seemed to shift slightly when I rounded a corner, though I had checked the restraints more than once. Sometimes I caught the faintest scrape or tap from the rear compartment, softer than a branch against glass. Once, as I checked the mirror, I saw clear as day a figure sitting beside the casket, a silhouette too tall and sharp to be a trick of the light, its face turned toward me, watching. I blinked, and it was gone, but the seatbelt on the far side was twisted, as if someone had only just let it go. On each return, the dashboard clock lost a few more minutes. My phone's battery drained by half, and my own reflection in the glass looked less and less familiar. The whispers sometimes grew urgent, especially as the clock neared the same impossible hour. I heard my name spoken, felt an ache behind my eyes. and caught myself answering, aloud promising, apologizing, asking for directions that would never come. The loop tightened, the world outside growing emptier with every pass. It felt as if I was driving on the edge of something vast and unseen. The hearse now a vessel drifting between places, ferrying not just the dead, but all the unresolved things they carried. Each time I looked in the mirror, I braced myself for that shadowy companion, certain now that the journey would not end until I understood what it meant to deliver a body to a place that did not exist, or at least, not in any world I'd ever known. It was after what must have been the 10th or 100th circuit time had lost all meaning, my watch stuck at the same blurred hour, that the answer finally arrived, not as a direction on a map, but as a feeling in my chest, an understanding that pressed in from every shadow. I sat behind the wheel, hands numb, rain blurring the world outside to watercolors. The GPS screen blanked now, its voice silent at last. The air in the hearse was so cold that each breath felt like drawing in fog from another world. The whispers behind me a chorus of longing, regret, and hope that had wound themselves into my own thoughts. It was then I noticed the envelope resting on the dashboard, pale and unmarked, a single name written on it in looping. Careful handwriting, a name that matched the tag on the casket in the back. I hadn't seen it before, yet it felt inevitable, as if it had been there waiting for me to notice all along. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside was a simple request. Read my name aloud. Remember me. Say goodbye so I can go. I turned to face the casket, the interior lights flickering as I spoke the name slowly, with reverence, letting the syllables fill the cabin and echo against the rain. For a moment, everything stilled. The whispers fell silent, the air warmed, and the pressure in my chest eased as if a burden I'd been carrying for hours or lifetimes had finally lifted. I closed my eyes, whispering a farewell, a promise that their journey would not be erased, that someone had witnessed their last ride. When I opened my eyes, the GPS screen flickered to life once more. For the first time, it displayed a street I recognized, not Merrill Lane, but the avenue leading straight to the city cemetery. I turned the key. The hearse started on the first try, and as I drove, the rain eased and the world sharpened back into focus. The loop was broken, the way forward open at last. As I arrived at the cemetery gates, dawn breaking at the horizon, I felt a peace settle over the car, a warmth in the air that felt like gratitude. I completed the delivery, heart pounding not with fear, but with a quiet certainty that I had done right by the lost and the waiting. And from that day on, I carried a new understanding. Sometimes, a funeral is not just a journey through the city, but a passage through memory and grief, a final act of remembrance that can free the restless and restore the living to their own path. The city, when I returned, was brighter, the roads familiar once again, and the silence in the hearse was finally just silence, nothing more. Story 9. On a Wednesday evening that began as uneventfully as any other, I was called in to take a late transfer routine paperwork, a short drive to a small chapel on the outskirts of town. The air outside was cold and clear, but as I opened the back of the funeral car, a wave of floral scent nearly knocked me back. It was overpowering, thick as syrup, nothing like the usual faded sweetness of old bouquets or the chemical tang of air fresheners. This was something else. Lily, roses, gardenias, all blooming at once, sharp and fresh and inexplicably alive. I assumed the family had chosen an unusually extravagant arrangement, but when I checked, the casket was bare, no flowers at all, not even a ribbon or a note from the bereaved. The fragrance clung to me as I got behind the wheel, so dense it seemed to settle on my tongue. I rolled down the windows, but the scent only deepened, as if it came not from anything material, but from the air itself, a warning wrapped in beauty. I tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to nerves or the ghost of a memory from a childhood garden, but the unease stayed with me. There are stories in this business old drivers muttering about the flower warning, the sign that something is about to go wrong, but I'd never given them much thought. Until that night, halfway through the drive, at a crosswalk I'd passed 100 times without incident, a flash of movement jolted me to a halt. I braked hard, tires shrieking, just in time to avoid hitting a stray dog that darted out of the shadows and vanished just as quickly. My heart hammered in my chest, adrenaline making the world too bright, a scent of flowers suddenly so strong I could taste it. There was no sign of the dog. When I checked the mirrors, only empty streets, the lonely glow of streetlights, and the thick perfume lingering like a question with no answer. I pulled over, hands trembling, and checked the car inside and out, looking for spilled chemicals, a hidden bouquet, any rational explanation. There was nothing, only the casket, silent and still, and the ghostly bouquet that would not leave. When I finally arrived at the chapel, the air outside was crisp and clean, but inside the car, the flowers were stronger than ever, swirling around my head as if urging me to pay attention. That was the night I realized the stories were more than superstition. The scent of flowers, sudden and inexplicable, was an omen, a gentle, fragrant warning that the line between the living and the dead was never as clear as I wanted to believe, and that some passengers bring with them more than just memories or grief. As I closed the doors and stepped into the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the flowers would return, each time a little stronger, each time with another message left unsent. The next morning, I scrubbed down the funeral car until my fingers were raw. Every inch of upholstery, every door handle, even the vents, none of it made a difference. The scent of flowers still clung to the cabin, impossibly fresh, blooming with every breath. I tried everything: air fresheners, scented candles at home, windows rolled down for miles of open road. Still, the perfume lingered, sometimes faint as a memory, sometimes blooming so vividly it felt as if I were kneeling in the heart of a greenhouse at midnight. It wasn't long before the others noticed. One of the younger attendants wrinkled his nose and asked if someone had left a wreath in the back seat. The night manager started making jokes about my perfume habit, but I saw the unease in his eyes as the scent intensified with each shift. It was never just a smell. It came with a pressure behind my eyes, a tightening in my chest, and a growing sense that I was being watched, or followed, or remembered by something I couldn't see. And it wasn't just the perfume that kept returning. Small, inexplicable things began to happen every time the flowers reappeared. The radio, dead for weeks, would sputter to life and hiss static at full volume at the worst moments, always at a crossroads or a turn I wasn't expecting. Streetlights would flicker and die as I passed beneath them, plunging the street into sudden shadow. Traffic, steady just a moment before, would vanish, leaving me alone in the city's sleeping heart. Sometimes the engine would stall without warning at a red light, forcing me to restart and wait in silence while the fragrance grew thicker, heavier, curling into the corners of the car like a warning that went deeper than the senses. Once, returning to the garage late, I glanced in the rear view and caught the fleeting impression of petals scattered across the back seat, vanishing as soon as I turned around. Another time, I found a single white lily resting on the dashboard, stems still wet with dew, though the doors had been locked and the car empty when I left it. I started to dread the moments when the perfume returned, each time bracing for something strange, something that would remind me again that the distance between the worlds was paper thin, and that the funeral car was as much a vessel for secrets as it was for the dead. No matter what I did, the scent would not be banished, and every time it returned, I knew the flowers were a warning, and something someone was still waiting for, a promise to be kept, a wrong to be righted, or a final message to be heard. The unease reached its peak on a night thick with storm clouds, the rain pounding the roof in relentless sheets as I set out on what should have been another ordinary transfer. The perfume of flowers was there from the start, oppressive, almost choking, far more powerful than before. It seeped from the vents and swirled in the darkness, filling every breath with its insistent sweetness. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the rhythm of the wipers, the road vanishing beneath the flood. But the scent only grew, filling the car until it felt like I was driving through a tunnel of petals. Halfway to the cemetery, the lights on the dashboard flickered. The radio hissed a burst of static, and then the engine cut out completely, stranding me in the middle of a deserted stretch of road. I tried the ignition again and again, but nothing happened. All I could do was sit in the gathering silence, my only company the heavy fragrance and the sound of rain. As I waited, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror, something pale and indistinct, moving in the shadows behind the casket. It was gone before I could focus, but the hairs on my arms prickled with the certainty that I was not alone. Finally, the engine sputtered back to life. I drove the rest of the way in tense silence, desperate to finish the job. When I arrived at the cemetery gate, the perfume reached its most unbearable intensity. I hurried to open the rear doors, heart hammering, only to freeze. The casket was empty. In its place, a scatter of crushed petals, lily, roses, gardenias damp and gleaming in the dim light. For a moment I was sure I had lost my mind, but when I searched the car, the grounds, even the roadside where I'd stalled, there was no sign of the body or any explanation for its disappearance. Only that floral scent, as thick as ever, seemed to follow me home, clinging to my clothes, my skin, even my dreams. I reported the incident, but the funeral home staff only shook their heads, muttering about paperwork errors, family mix-ups, or worse. They wouldn't say it aloud, but I could see it in their eyes. They had all heard stories like mine. The body gone without a trace, the car full of impossible flowers, and the silent knowledge that some passengers are never meant to rest until something unfinished has been put to rights. Each night after, I checked the back seat for petals, held my breath at every hint of sweetness in the air, and wondered when or if the next disappearance would come. I could no longer dismiss the whispers that drifted through the garage at night, nor the knowing looks from older drivers when I returned after another floral-soaked run. On a rare quiet shift, one cornered one of the retired attendants, a man whose stories were usually dismissed as embellishments from too many years spent with the dead. He listened without interruption as I described the perfume, the accidents, the night the body vanished. When I finished, he simply nodded and asked, "Did you ever break a promise to the dead? Marry someone against their will? Did you ever ignore a family's plea?" He told me the old stories then, not as rumors, but as warnings. There had always been a legend among funeral workers, passed down in coffee-stained notebooks and low-voiced conversations. Whenever the perfume of fresh-cut flowers filled a funeral car with no explanation, it meant the soul inside was unsettled, buried in anger, sorrow, or the loneliness of an unkept promise. The scent was a signal, a plea for justice, for remembrance, for the living to make right what had been denied in life or death. Drivers who ignored the warning found themselves at the center of strange misfortunes caskets that would not open, families that refused to claim the body, flowers blooming in impossible places. Some spoke of accidents that seemed designed to force a delay, to prevent the burial until someone listened. The old man's eyes grew distant as he recounted the worst tales. A driver whose car filled with Lilith before every storm, always followed by a tragedy, a body lost and never recovered, with petals turning up at the driver's door for months after. Sometimes the family's grief was so deep, or the circumstances so unjust, a wrongful burial, a broken vow, a life cut short, that the soul would not rest, demanding the living take notice before disaster could be averted. "You have to pay attention," he told me, voice gravelly but gentle. "Sometimes it's not about what you see, but what you sense, the smell, the silence, the little things out of place. If you ever want to be free of the flowers, you have to find out what the soul wants. Sometimes it's an apology. Sometimes it's the truth. Sometimes it's just someone willing to listen." I left that conversation changed, the perfume in my car no longer just a warning, but an invitation. If I ever hoped to drive without fear of what waited in the darkness, I knew I would have to answer the plea that came wrapped in blossoms, a final chance to do what was right before the curse became my own. The next time the call came, it was a job that should have felt routine, another midnight transfer for a burial scheduled at dawn. But as soon as I sat in the driver's seat, the perfume hit me with suffocating force, lily and roses blooming together in a scent so thick I gagged, the air as dense as a funeral parlor in high summer. The radio, which hadn't worked in months, clicked on by itself, low static hissing between old hymns and snatches of memory. It felt as though the entire car was waiting, tense and silent, for a choice I didn't yet understand. The drive was slow, every traffic light stuck on red, the streets empty except for the halo of my headlights. I kept glancing in the rearview, half expecting to see the seat full of petals or a shadow staring back. When I finally stopped outside the cemetery gates, the scent intensified to the point where I could barely breathe. I sat for a moment, clutching the wheel, and remembered what the old attendant had said, find out what the soul wants. I forced myself to open the rear door, the perfume almost a physical presence. There on the casket was a single sheet of paper, a letter, written in careful, trembling script. It was a plea. Do not bury me until my sister arrives. Please, let her say goodbye. My hands shook as I realized no family had been scheduled for the service. Just a hasty burial by city order, the kind reserved for those who had no one left to care. The truth made my skin crawl. All those delays, all those strange malfunctions, had been attempts pleas for someone to wait. I called the funeral home, insisted they check the old records. Incredibly, after a flurry of late-night calls, a sister was found estranged, distant, but desperate for a last farewell. She arrived at dawn, the car still thick with that perfume, her grief raw and unfiltered as she clung to the casket and whispered words only she and her brother would ever understand. When the time came to close the grave, the scent faded at last, dissolving into the cold morning air, leaving behind nothing but quiet. The car was clean after that day. No more perfume, no more petals, no more radio static or unexplainable chills. I understood now. Every time the scent of flowers filled the funeral car, it was a sign that someone's story was not yet finished, a plea waiting to be heard. From then on, I drove with the windows open and my eyes and heart wide, promising to listen for the next warning, to carry every passenger as if their last wish was my own. And in that promise, the distance between the living and the dead felt for once just a little less impossible. Story 10. It was the kind of night that feels endless before it even begins, the city emptying itself of color and noise as midnight approached. I had finished my scheduled rounds for the funeral home, paperwork done, keys ready to turn in, when the phone rang a last-minute request. A body to be delivered across town before dawn. Extra shifts meant extra cash, and though my bones ached with fatigue, I couldn't say no. The streets were slick with fog as I loaded the casket and set out, headlights slicing tunnels through the mist, the dashboard clock ticking ever slower as the city grew quiet. The drive was uneventful, just me, the hum of the engine, and the soft rattle from the rear compartment. I made the delivery, signed the forms, exchanged a few words with a yawning attendant at the chapel. The world felt heavy and subdued, as if the city itself had gone to sleep. By the time I pulled back into the garage, the sky was turning faintly gray. I was alone of that, I was certain. I checked the locks twice, turned off the ignition, gathered my things in the hush that follows the end of a long shift. But as I stepped out and turned to look one last time into the car, a habit as old as my job, my heart froze. There, in the passenger seat, was a silhouette, perfectly still, more a smudge against the darkness than a figure, but unmistakably present. Shoulders squared, head tilted as if looking straight ahead, unmoving. I stared, pulse roaring in my ears, convinced for a moment I had left the door unlocked and someone had slipped in. Yet when I shined my phone's flashlight on the seat, there was nothing but empty upholstery and the imprint of a shape that shouldn't have been there. The interior light flickered, and I backed away, telling myself it was a trick of fatigue and shadows, that I'd been working too many nights in a row. Still, the image burned into my memory, the uncanny sense of someone waiting to be acknowledged, a presence too patient, too quiet to be explained away by exhaustion. I locked the doors, checked the lot, forced a shaky laugh as I walked to my own car. But the sense of being watched, of having left a passenger behind, followed me home. That night, as I tried to sleep, the silhouette sat with me in my thoughts, and I understood with a cold certainty that some rides are never truly over, especially not in the small hours, when the city holds its breath, and the dead are not the only ones lingering in the dark. The next night, determined to prove to myself that exhaustion had played tricks on my mind, I checked every inch of the car before starting my shift. Doors locked, windows up, no sign of stray belongings or footprints on the floor mats. I even asked the attendant to double-check the log. No passengers, no unexpected stops, nothing unusual recorded. Yet the unease lingered, thickening each time I glanced at the empty passenger seat before setting out. With each shift, the pattern grew more disturbing. I'd finish my last drop-off, triple-check the car, then, just as I was about to leave the lot, there it was again, the silhouette. Sometimes I'd glimpse it in the reflection of a store window as I idled at a red light. Other nights, it appeared just as I flicked off the headlights, materializing in the passenger seat as if drawn from the shadows by the act of ending my route. No matter how careful I was, how many times I locked and unlocked the doors, it always appeared, silent and still, eyes fixed straight ahead. I tried to reason it away, blamed the exhaustion, the poor lighting, the weight of too many funerals and too little sleep. But as the weeks went by, my nerves began to fray. Each night I returned home more agitated, convinced I could feel a presence beside me, just beyond the edge of my vision. The silhouette never moved, never made a sound, but its patience was suffocating a silent passenger determined to finish a journey I could not remember starting. Sleep became impossible. I lay awake, replaying every mile, every stop, every moment of the night. Sometimes, as I drifted on the edge of dreams, I'd see the silhouette waiting in the driveway, or perched in the passenger seat of my own car, eyes empty, mouth unmoving. I stopped mentioning it to colleagues, unwilling to be laughed at or pitied, but the isolation only grew. In the silence of the late shift, it became clear. It didn't matter how many locks I turned or lights I left burning. The last passenger of the night always found its way back into my car, and now into my life waiting, silent, for something only it understood. It wasn't just the nightly silhouette anymore. Its presence began to ripple through the ordinary details of my routine, leaving a trail of impossible evidence marks that wouldn't scrub out, frost that lingered on the inside of the window, the chill that seeped into the car long after the engine had cooled. One morning, I found the faint outline of a hand pressed into the passenger side fog, fingers slender and splayed as if reaching out for comfort or release. Another night, returning from a quick coffee run, there was an indentation in the seat cushion, deep and unmistakable, though the car had been locked behind me the entire time. Reflections became my enemy. In the rearview mirror, the angle would catch just enough shadow to sketch the shape of a head, the outline of a shoulder, as if someone sat perfectly still beside me, only to vanish when I looked directly. Sometimes, in the side window glass, I'd glimpse not my own face, but a pale mask hovering behind mine, eyes dark and blank, mouth unmoving. The temperature inside the car plummeted without warning, my breath fogging the windshield in patterns that almost looked like words. A message I could never quite decipher. It wasn't just me. One of the cleaners, finishing up a quick vacuum after my shift, emerged pale and shivering, mumbling something about feeling watched and a cold spot on the passenger side. A dispatcher hesitated before entering the car to check the odometer, only to back out after a few seconds, shaking her head. No one ever saw the silhouette directly, not the way I did, but they all sensed something was off. In the break room, the drivers traded stories, radios turning on by themselves at midnight, a shadow caught in the security camera footage for a single frame, a persistent smell of old cologne or cigarettes from a seat that should have been empty for months. I started avoiding the car, taking longer to begin my shifts, dreading the moment I'd have to open the door and wonder if, this time, the last passenger might do more than just sit and wait. The silence stretched longer each night, the city's lights fading to nothing as I drove my routes. I became a ghost myself, haunted by the one presence I couldn't explain and increasingly couldn't ignore. The line between my fear and the world's indifference grew thinner, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the shadow beside me demanded more than a silent ride through the dark. Sleep-deprived and desperate for answers, I started digging through the funeral home's records late at night, poring over yellowed ledgers and faded files that spanned decades. I was looking for anything: an accident, an unsolved disappearance, a night gone wrong. As the hours slipped by, patterns began to emerge. Cryptic notes left by previous drivers, scattered mentions of odd feelings after midnight runs, and once, a scribbled line, "Passenger never arrived," buried at the bottom of an incident report dated nearly 20 years ago. I found an archived article in the city paper, a clipping glued to the back page of an old logbook. It told the story of a young man who vanished during a routine funeral transfer, last seen just after 3 a.m., his route matching the one I'd been driving. No evidence, no sign of struggle, just a car found idling in the lot with the doors locked and the keys still in the ignition. The family never found closure. The case was quietly closed, lost in the shuffle of newer tragedies. I brought the story up in passing to one of the old-timers, a gruff dispatcher who'd worked the late shift since before the building had central heat. She wouldn't look at me as she told her version, how drivers would sometimes return pale and distant, complaining of a cold that seeped into their bones, of a heaviness in the seat beside them, of the sense that the car was never truly empty. "We used to say he just wanted to go home," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if the story itself could summon the ghost. Piecing it all together, I realized the presence had haunted these late-night drives for years, moving from driver to driver, car to car. Every extra shift, every last run through empty city streets was a chance for the silhouette to appear again, silent, patient, and unresolved. Perhaps it was looking for its destination, or for someone to recognize it, or maybe just for a final moment of acknowledgement before it could rest. The passenger's identity, erased by time and indifference, persisted only as a shape in the dark, remembered by the living only when the city was at its loneliest. That knowledge weighed on me every time I turned the key. I wondered what would happen if I finally faced the shadow head-on, if I could give it the closure denied for so many years, or if I, too, would be marked by its need for a journey that could never quite end. The silhouette remained, night after night, waiting for an ending I was no longer sure I could deliver. On a night heavier than any before, I arrived for what I decided would be my final shift, the last time I would confront the city's darkness with only a steering wheel and a ghost for company. The garage was deserted, rain tapping on the concrete roof, the funeral car waiting for me like a confession. My routine was deliberate, doors checked, windows locked, paperwork complete, every possible rational excuse stripped away. I sat behind the wheel, eyes fixed on the empty passenger seat, and spoke aloud, "If you're coming with me tonight, let's settle this together." The drive was silent, the city shrinking to a tunnel of wet asphalt and flickering streetlights. As the hour approached 3, I felt the familiar weight in the air, the shift in temperature, and when I glanced over, the silhouette was there clearer than ever, its face a suggestion, its eyes pools of shadow. For once, I did not avert my gaze. I gripped the wheel with one hand and with the other, reached out, palm open, offering a gesture of acceptance. "I know you're waiting for something," I whispered, my words lost in the hush of the rain. "If you need a different route, tell me. If you want to be remembered, I see you. If you're lost, I'll bring you home." For a moment, nothing changed. Then, a deep quiet settled over the car, a stillness so profound that even the city's ever-present noise vanished. The silhouette seemed to lift its head, as if recognizing the moment, and I felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude and sorrow, ancient and human, and aching for closure. The rest of the drive unfolded in a strange clarity, as if a fog had been burned away. The silhouette faded from view, leaving only the warmth of a seat that was, at last, empty. When I returned to the garage at dawn, the car felt lighter, the air inside blessedly ordinary. I stepped out, heart pounding with relief, and locked the doors behind me, knowing that, for the first time in too many nights, the last passenger had finally reached their destination. From that night forward, the stories among the drivers changed. No one else saw the silhouette, no more chills haunted the late shift, and for the first time, I slept undisturbed. I still think of that final ride, sometimes, as I drive through the city's empty streets. I remember what it meant to see a soul through to the end, and how the quiet afterward was not emptiness, but peace, a gift for both the dead and the living. delivered in the silent hours before sunrise.